Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's 7:30 on Tuesday, March 12th, and this is our annual public hearing to hear parties related to the fiscal 2025 budgets that are now in front of us. So what I will ask is if there's anyone that would like to speak at the public hearing, as per our agenda that we sent out, we'd ask you to keep it based on the budgets that are in front of us tonight. Limit your comments to 3 minutes, and if you could, before you speak, just sign in with your name and address on the sign-up sheet up here. So with that, I would open it up. Is there anyone that would like to come up and speak as part of public comment?
You want to start with these and then I'll...
Okay. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Christina Cruz, and I live on 3 Nutmeg Lane. I am the budget co-chair for the Council of Darien School Parents, the umbrella organization for all 7 of Darien's PTOs. On behalf of CDSP, I wish to express our support of the Board of Education's proposed budget for $121,864,474 for the 2024-2025 school year. As you know, 4.65% of the 6.48% year-over-year increase is a contractually negotiated increase in teacher compensation. Additionally, the district is contending with a 13.85% rise in healthcare costs, a 2.23% increase in legally mandated special education costs, as well as a new bus contract and overall inflation impacts. Despite this difficult environment, the members of the Board of Education carefully considered the superintendent's budget and proposed modifications based on conversation and public comment from administration, teachers, aides, parents, and students. While some may view the 6.48% increase to be considerable, it aligns us with the proactive stances of our peer districts. New Canaan's Board of Finance has just approved a budget with an increase of 6.59%, and Westport has a proposed increase of 8.08% for fiscal year 25. These are the towns competing with us in sports, academic rankings, and home values. We are requesting that the Board of Finance approve this budget without any alterations. Parents have come out in support to demonstrate their support for this budget. A reduction in funding would mean compromising the quality of education in our town. The Board of Education has already debated and decided on teacher FTE reductions. Should the Board of Finance decide that the town could not afford this budget, the only place left for the superintendent to cut is in areas directly related to student programming. Education is one of Darien's most valuable assets. Lately, parents have asked us why it seems that the town is cutting education but just purchased Great Island. We remind them that when this purchase was debated before the RTM vote, the Board of Finance promised that there would be no downward financial pressure on education. We can have both. The town believes in investing in our crown jewels, and Darien Public Schools is our biggest one. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Vicki Coughlin here? Hi there.
Hi, my name is Vicki Coughlin. I live at 9 Canoe Trail. I am the chair of the Middlesex Parents Association. I watched the March 5th Board of Finance meeting where Chairperson McCammon presented the Board of Education's budget. And based on the feedback, I just wanted to take a few minutes to review how the team model at the middle school is supported by the current level of teaching staff included in the BOE's budget for next year and is vital for its proper execution. The team model is in fact a more expensive choice than, say, a junior high model. However, the benefits of the team model at MMS, which is one of the biggest middle schools in the state of Connecticut, far outweigh the increase in cost. Without it, our children would be lost during these challenging developmental years. In its current form, the team model allows for each team to be comprised of a distinct and consistent set of teachers to guide about 85 children from the first day of school to the last. It affords these 85 students the opportunity to feel less overwhelmed by the sudden transition from a small and familiar grade of 70 kids to a grade with 350 kids, yet still experience a bell schedule with different students in each class. When faced with the overwhelmingly negative feedback from the parent community on eliminating one team of teachers, the administration proposed several additional underdeveloped options, but none of them adequately ensured a continued appropriate implementation of the current team model. The fact is, cutting teachers is not simple math. The average class size may still be within the district's policy, but averages are misleading, which is why in part I believe the BOE rejected the core subject teacher cuts. In fact, the current small classes are for the most part specialty classes, not core classes. Cutting core teachers keeps the small classes small and makes the big classes bigger. Basing decisions on averages only works in a vacuum. On the ground, in the school, in our students' reality, it creates conditions that negatively impact the daily experience at MMS. Finally, in the discussion on Monday about the number of classes a teacher can contractually teach, I believe a key point was missed. Even though about 40 teachers at MMS currently only teach 4 classes, simply assigning them to now teach 5 classes would be a direct violation of the teacher's contract. Teachers may only teach 5 classes through attrition, not reduction in teachers as a result of budget cuts. These 40 teachers would not be able to teach a 5th class next year. Thank you for your time, and please show the community your continued support of our schools by voting to keep the Board of Ed's budget as is. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shelly Cinch. Do we give our address here?
I think when you finish, just state your
sorry.
name and address when you finish,
Okay.
if you could write it down.
Shelly Cinch, 34 LaForge Road. I only have a 16-month-old, but seeing what was happening with the Board of Education and reviewing stuff, it became apparent that obviously parents who have very younger kids need to start getting involved so that people moving to Darien are under the impression that we are expecting an exceptional education for our kids. That's why you pay to live here. And some of the cuts seemed a little troubling in terms of the arts, language. You don't just rebuild programs overnight. So I wanted to come and give my support for maintaining the budget. Honestly, I think some of the other school or the other teachers should have not been cut from it. But yeah, I just wanted to come and say that I will be discussing with a lot of other young mothers as well. My husband graduated from Darien, and I've learned a lot about how school used to be. He graduated in '03, so their family's lived here a long time. I'm not from here, I'm from Texas, and so it was quite a bit of a shock that I was expecting more. I'll just say that. From Darien, so I would like to throw my support behind keeping the budget as is, and hopefully maybe we can get it to where it might need to be later in the future.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Going once, going twice? Okay. Well, if there are no other speakers, we can adjourn the annual public hearing, Board of Finance public hearing on the budget. Can I get a motion to adjourn? John moves. Taylor seconds. All those in favor? It's unanimous. Okay. Okay, I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Board of Finance to order at 7:40 on Tuesday, March 12th. The first order of business at this meeting, like it is at every one of our meetings, is going to be for public comment. Does anyone in the audience have any public comment for items on our regular meeting schedule? Okay, hearing none. Then we'll move to the first regular item on our agenda, which are a series of 3 different transfers.
Right, the first one you have is a salary transfer from salary contingency to various accounts for Public Works and Park and Rec employees in the general fund, the sewer fund, and the parking fund. This is a result of the settlement of their contract and the wage increases that were agreed to in that contract. At the time that we set the budget, their contract was expiring. We didn't know the new rates, so there was an estimate put into salary contingency. now that we know how those various accounts are going to end up for the year, we're looking to transfer what's needed within those accounts. They have had a couple vacancies here and there, so this is not the full cost of all those employees. This is only what's needed in the salary accounts.
Jen, I just had one question. There's a comment on the second page that the required transfer is less than what was budgeted for the wage increases.
Yes.
By how much, approximately?
20,000-ish.
Thank you.
And Jen, how much of that is price versus quantity, if you think about, not since not all the positions are filled?
Quantity is more.
Okay. Any other questions regarding this transfer? Okay. I'll accept the motion to request $53,459 to be transferred from various salary accounts as shown on attachment 1. Dan moves. Dave seconds. All those in favor? It's unanimous.
For the police department, we have Captain Hidema here.
Hello, good evening. Captain Allison Hademo at the Darien Police Department. You've seen me here before. Today I'm here to ask for a transfer of funds for a motorcycle to help out our traffic unit. So our traffic unit started with a motorcycle in 2006. It's one of 2 vehicles that traffic officer uses. And we've had it all the way through until 22 when our traffic officer at the time retired. He retired February 1st, 2022. We have been leasing motorcycles up until this time. We did not have a lease when he retired because we did not replace him in that unit. So now that we have a replacement for that officer, we are looking to purchase a motorcycle instead of lease due to costs associated with leasing these days. When I got all the quotes from our upfitter, the cost of a lease and the cost to purchase, it made more sense for the town to purchase a vehicle and keep it for an extended period of time. We wouldn't have to switch out the equipment on that vehicle and upfit it. That's a major cost every couple years. So the cost, I laid it out for an 8-year plan. Typically motorcycles last more than 8 years. This one, for instance, is only going to be ridden by 1 officer and partial, time over the year. So a couple of months out of the 12, it's going to be ridden. So there won't be a high mileage placed on that vehicle. So we're expecting it to last a long period of time. Currently, we're budgeted for $5,700 as a lease for a year. The upfit cost is over $13,000. And then every 2 years, we would have to strip that and then put it back onto a newer motorcycle if we were to continue to lease. So I just think it would save the town money if we purchased the vehicle and then kept it. I've talked to other towns that have motorcycle officers, and typically when one officer rides that motorcycle, it lasts more than 8 years. But I was trying to be conservative with my cost analysis here and I showed over 8 years, it saves the town over $40,000. Obviously, this officer in another town said usually his riders last 10 to 12 years on one motorcycle. So with that kind of idea, which I think would be similar here in Darien, we'd get much more benefit if we purchased it.
At the Board of Selectmen meeting last night, you articulated the benefit of having a motorcycle versus just another vehicle. Can you go through that for this board?
Sure. So we use our motorcycle for multiple uses, not only traffic enforcement. That's probably the main use for our motorcycle. I explained this last night, if you're driving your vehicle and we're looking to enforce some laws of the road, going through red lights, stop signs, yielding to vehicles where you should be. If you see a police car in front of you, right, you're going to obey the laws. But you typically aren't looking for a motorcycle, or you may not see that motorcycle. So we can place the motorcycle in strategic spots in order to enforce, different traffic laws. We also use the vehicle for road races. We usually have them either at the front or the back of a road race to protect the runners. We have them at parades. We use them for community engagement. We use them for funeral escorts. There's a whole kind of thing, there's a lot of purposes for this motorcycle. Typically, it is for traffic enforcement. Obviously, the whole purpose of traffic enforcement is to cut down on areas where we find most accidents. And so we'd like to target those areas. Yes?
The proposal by the upfitting company was valid for 30 days as of November. Is that still good?
That quote, I have an updated number. He couldn't provide me with the quote for tonight, but there is an increase of 3.9% on the Wayland items. So I calculated that out with him today, and he believed it to be no more than another additional $500. The amount doesn't change his cost, it's just the cost of the parts.
And then as far as the components that you guys had to provide, is that baked in here somewhere too? Did you already?
No, we purchased those items.
But they're not in here, like the computer, the.
Right, we purchased those separately.
Oh, you already
We're not
did?
asking for that.
Okay,
Yes.
The Wall Street Journal reports that sales of Harleys are plummeting. The reason they give, for better or for worse, is that all the baby boomers that wanted one already have one. And that sales are, in fact, like I said, they're declining. Are you satisfied you're getting a competitive price on this?
Yes, I believe we are.
Thank you.
Kip, I have a question. In terms of the lease cost, the $5,700 per year, was all of the uplift, the $13,000 worth of installation, was that built into the lease, or was that going to be sort of, lessee installed equipment?
We would have to provide that additional on the side. That was not part of the lease. And part of that, I believe, was, we didn't know when we were going to get our next traffic unit officer. So we didn't want to put money into something we weren't going to use when, if we weren't sure we were going to purchase it.
Understood, but the transfer tonight is to acquire the motorcycle for 21 and to pay for the uplift, all of the
Yes.
incremental.
Yes.
But importantly, the uplift equipment should last the life of the motorcycle, and it's only installed once, right? Rather than if you lease a vehicle, you have to deinstall it, reinstall it.
Right,
et cetera.
correct. I can't say if we keep the motorcycle 12 years, it
Yeah,
would
right,
last
right.
12 years, but it would
Right.
last at least 8, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any estimate for if you leased it for the first 2 years and then bought it out of the lease at the end, so that you didn't have to re-upfit it at the end of 2 years, what that cost would be?
I did not get a cost on that, no.
Okay.
Well, I think certainly leasing versus owning, the cost of leasing over the last year has shot up dramatically.
Right.
And particularly for shorter term specialty leases, just in my business. So I think the own versus lease seems like a very obvious decision. When do you expect to take delivery of it?
If we order within the next week or so, they said 4 to 5 weeks for delivery, and then it would be the upfit time. So I would assume another month or 2 after that.
And where exactly will you be hiding out looking for speeders? Okay. Any other questions?
You can share that with us later.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll accept the motion to transfer from the Board of Finance Capital Reserve $35,542. Actually, hold on a second. Do you need that to be increased by the 500 or no?
Yes, so, okay, yes. So the
So
cost he gave me today,
36,042?
the upfit cost
36,042, right?
Yeah.
14,200, and it was 13,
566.
right.
And it's now 14.2?
He's on Hummingbird today.
14.2 would be with the 3.9% increase.
Sorry, what's your total? Change it. I get 36,175.
Okay, it's a little more.
36,175?
Yep.
Okay, I'll accept the motion to request a transfer from the Board of Finance Capital Reserve for $36,175 to the account for the acquisition of a new police motorcycle and related outfitting. Taylor moves. David seconds. All those in favor? It's unanimous. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
The next transfer is related to ARPA. There's a list of several accounts on the first page that we are looking to close out balances and utilize contingency funds to fund what is on the second page, which are items that were in the Board of Selectmen capital budget. They were requested in the town administrator's budget, and the Board of Selectmen reviewed them and removed them from the budget with the proposal to fund them through ARPA. This, you talked about a little bit last week. It did go to the ARPA committee, and this is just the formal closeout. I do have a couple of numbers to update. We had a one final charge come through on the Old Kings Highway pipelining. So that's actually now going to be a transfer of $8,493.39. And the ARPA contingency amount is going to go up to $60,770.93. Because we also had a 5-cent rounding error, but the total transfer is still $479,886.
And the same amount is going to be fully allocated among the 6 items or 7 items, right?
Right, they'll be allocated in the amounts that you see on the second page, the largest of which is the $400,000 for the loader. And then what you see as backup to this item, we did ask all of the departments for status updates on their projects. So this is their response on that. A few of them will be going back. We know that we can get more out of them. We just don't know how much at this time because they're working through a few things. But last night, the Board of Selectmen asked for a status update by April 1st. So we're going to be reaching back to all the departments again. And we'll probably do that on every month or every other month just to make sure that we're always scraping those balances and have time to reallocate them. So you'll see items like this coming before you for the next few months.
So Jen, just maybe a question on the items besides the loader. Are we pretty confident that all of these dollars that are going to be allocated will 100% be spent in the near term?
Yes, that is the expectation.
Okay, and what about the loader? Just given the sort of the round number of the 400,000, is that a portion of what's the aggregate price expected to be?
No more than 400,000. So once the appropriation is available, Ed will be able to either go out to bid or find it off of a purchasing cooperative or state bid, wherever he can find the best pricing. And then anything associated with it, other items that we have to purchase in addition to the actual loader itself, we'll get those ordered. We'll have the total amount and we'll get it all encumbered. If we spend less than the 400,000, that'll be one that we bring back to you to reallocate what is not needed.
And when does he expect to actually take delivery or sign a contract?
That I don't know. All I know is that it'll be well before December 31st.
I should report, Jim and I were on the ARPA committee. I voted against this reallocation, as I reported last week. It was a 4-to-1 vote in favor of this reallocation. I was the lone dissent, and my concern was simply over not entirely, but almost virtually closing out the mental health and food insecurity accounts. I was disappointed that we haven't been able, I understand that the grant process is complicated, particularly given the rules that ARPA has imposed upon us. I was disappointed that we haven't found other ways to expend that money, and I expressed that disappointment through my vote. I also understand that the balance of the reallocation makes total sense. So I'll be voting no, consistent with how I voted last week, but it's for that very specific reason.
Yeah, and I think maybe, I did vote yes in that ARPA meeting, and I would say, I think to make it clear to everyone, it wasn't that the town wasn't supporting or did not think mental health was important. It was a question of whether or not by December 31st midnight this year, we would have exactly mapped out to the T the way in which all of these funds would be spent, and then we would be ensured that they would be spent sort of that way over the next 2 years. Because if we didn't, the risk was we would just need to send the money back. And so I think this was more of a sort of accounting administration, kind of blue versus green dollar, not whether or not it was, not whether it's important to all of us, which I'm sure it is, right? Much more of an accounting issue, so. So, any other questions on the ARPA transfers? Okay, I'll accept the motion to transfer $479,886 as outlined in our attachment 3 in our packet. Taylor moves. David seconds. All those in favor? All those opposed? Okay, passes 4-1. Okay, next section regarding discussion and possible actions are the first and probably largest discussion item tonight is going to be our upcoming bond issuance in April, right? There's a few new projects that we need to fund, and there are a few additional projects, namely the acquisition of Great Island and related improvements, and the beginning of funding HHR, where we need to make determinations in terms of whether we continue to roll short-term financing or whether we take a portion of it and bounce it out to 20 or 30-year financing.
All right, so Mark Chapman from Unistat is here. Yeah, you can pull up a chair if you want, or podium. So Mark and I have been working on this, and we're continuing with kind of the same idea that we presented to you last year, using a combination of bonds and notes over the next few years to roll on the debt for Great Island and HHR so that we don't spike our debt service in the budget. And we can take advantage of what's rolling off over these next couple years and smooth that a little bit. So we are targeting April 9th for the sale, and if that all comes together perfectly, we will have the actual numbers for you when you do your budget vote. So we'll be able to make adjustments and have the real numbers in the budget. Otherwise, we'll have to work off of an estimate. And then we plan to have the closing on April 25th, which coincides with the maturity of our current bond, our current notes. So the main factors influencing the amounts to be borrowed are cash flow, budgetary impact, and required borrowing timelines. Once we start spending, we have to issue within a certain amount of time in order to reimburse ourselves. So that does put a little bit of pressure. We can't just wait and issue far into the future. So that's what I mean when I say required borrowing timelines. Attachment 1 in your packet shows the recommended amounts to be borrowed. The majority of that is for HHR. And at this time, we're recommending that the $49 million that we took as notes for Great Island remain as notes. At the moment, the committee is still working through kind of that phase 1 access part of the project, and we don't yet know what we might do with the property. Depending on what we do with the property, we may need to issue the bonds as taxable. So leaving them as notes for now gives us a little more flexibility for the committee to work through some future uses, and we'll evaluate this again next year and see if we're needing to issue taxable bonds or if we could issue them as tax exempt. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, we can roll them this year, but next year we could roll them as notes again, but we have to make a principal pay down?
Correct.
Okay.
I believe it'd be a 1/30th principal pay down.
So we could still leave them as notes next year if things are still up in the air, but we would have to make a pay down.
Until the committee determines what they're going to do with it, or if it's decided, then you can do part of it as taxable, part of it tax exempt.
Just to understand what you say, so you would have to pay down 1/30th? Is that what you?
Correct.
Of the note?
Of the
So
49
million times 1/30th,
yeah.
we'd have to make a principal.
Correct.
Thank you.
Maybe for the committee and for the public, if you just explain That's based on a certain timeline, right, of when we spent our first dollar? Or the first dollar that we're looking to reimburse with bond proceeds,
The
right?
required pay down is a result of when we first issued the notes.
So April of last year. So you're allowed to roll them twice. So we issued them once. Somebody didn't like that. You issued them once. This would be the second year. By the third year maturity, you have to make a decision to either permanently finance it. You can continue to roll it, but you have to start making principal pay downs. That's the state statute requires that.
Mark, can you walk me through this issue of potentially having to issue taxable bonds? What causes that? And if I recall correctly, at the time of the purchase of Great Island, there was actually an estimate put out for the dollar amount of possible taxable bonds to be issued, but I'm not seeing that number reflected in this forecast.
I don't think we put out a dollar amount. I think what we did is we worked with bond counsel to determine the quantum of sort of private activity that would need to take place in order to cross the various thresholds that could then begin to characterize any of the bonds as taxable.
So for private use, if it's related, like tangentially related to public use, we can have up to 10% of our total issue for the project can be private use that's kind of related to public use. If it's not related to public use, we only have a 5% threshold. At the time that we first went to get the approval on Great Island, I think what you're thinking of is we showed the debt service if we issued tax exempt bonds or if we had to issue them as taxable, and what was the difference, because the taxable are a higher rate. So that's, I think what you're remembering is that we showed the difference in debt service.
So we don't have any even rough estimate for the thresholds at this point?
No. It depends on what the use is. If it is related to a public use, we have up to 10%. And it's revenue stream over the life of the bonds, present valued back. There's quite a calculation.
So if the max is 10% currently, and it could be 5%, we wouldn't want to go ahead and term out, like leave 10% of the notes outstanding and term out the balance?
Does the 10% threshold correlate to the amount of
That you have to issue
of
as
taxable
taxable?
bonds? That's the
It's the
question.
total issuance. So if that bond issue is 50 million, it's 10%
Yeah.
of that issuance.
That
Not
we're allowed
necessarily-
to earn as
Correct.
private
Okay,
use.
so it is a correlation
face
to the
value.
percentage that is non-private, non-public?
It's not whether it's being used, it's not like if you rent the property for one day,
Right.
then 1/365th becomes private activity. If you rented the property for one day and and you charged $100 to rent the property and it cost you 99 to prepare to run it, then you would say you earned $1 and you would look at it over the total expenditure of interest, principal, cost, everything. So the threshold to get to a point where the amount of private activity net profit that you're generating sort of off of the island could force you to make some portion of it be taxable is fairly significant, right? And I don't think anything that's been discussed so far
Is that number.
is
Right.
even related.
No,
to that.
I think what Dave and I are trying to understand is how much of the bond issue has to be taxable?
Yeah.
Is that a direct correlation to the amount of private activity? And you're saying, I think you said yes.
That's the calculation.
Right.
Right, so
Yeah.
if it puts you over that 10%, then you have to calculate what percentage has to be taxable.
Right. So if it's 17% of the revenue is private, then 17% of the note issue would have to be, or the bond issue would have to be taxable?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not a bond counsel, just.
Okay,
for the-
yeah, all
But if it's
right.
below the threshold, none. You're
Right, no,
allowed certain grace
yes.
periods,
Right.
Yes.
but again, I
Once
don't.
you're over the threshold, that's what I'm.
Yeah, but just to be clear, it's not if 10% of the acreage, it's really sort of a.
So the question is whether we should be, and I know we're in a likely decreasing rate environment, likely
Yeah.
being the operative word, We don't really know where rates are going, but we think rates are going lower. So there's a compelling reason to stay in notes. But if there was absent a compelling reason to stay in notes, we'd be a little heavy on notes here, because it's the risk of us being almost over 50% in private activity is nil.
So the other piece of this is overall, what you have before you is keeping 49 million as notes, but issuing 33,000 as bonds for HHR and the other items. So if we were to take more, if we decided we wanted to leave maybe 10% as notes in anticipation of that might have to be taxable, we would be bonding much more than I think we want the budget to take on immediately. So that's part of the strategy with using a combination of bonds and notes.
Because it triggers a principal payment? Right, the debt service kicks in earlier?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and interest rate on a one-year note is typically lower than
Right.
on bonds, typically.
Typically,
And
not
again,
less, not
so-
this year. but-
Plus, there's a compelling reason to stay in short term, because there is the expectation that rates will come down.
So I think
we don't-
Jen's early comment was like, the decision to roll that 49 in bands, it's not solely related because we think 50% is going to be
Right.
taxable. That's one of the reasons, which
Right.
could be 1% or 2% or whatever. It's overall interest cost that we would put inside this budget. And while the taxable curve is inverted that we all see right now, which is why our investment earnings are up so significantly, the municipal curve has generally at all times remained upward sloping.
With the exception of the last 6
Yeah.
months or so. And right now,
Yeah.
it is inverted, but, so one-year note is the same as a 20-year bond.
And
So it's flat, we're not actually paying more to keep it short.
You're not paying more, because the 20-year, the estimate on a 20-year bond currently is relatively the same as a one-year note. So the yield curve right now is high, it stays high, and then it dips, and then it levels out at the 20-year.
We're not saving anything by staying short,
I would
other than
assume
where
we're
we
paying
might
more.
issue a year from now.
Right.
Right.
I think primarily, when just talking, and maybe I'm incorrect, is more about phasing this in versus trying to target the market and all those things. It might, I think, I'm not the only person thinking this, but there's a lot of experts believe next year rates are going to be lower. So you would probably benefit from that as well.
Yeah. Last year, I think we did, our band was at approximately 2.7%, and the blended average interest cost on our 30-year bonds were 3.7%.
Right.
So I guess to summarize, what I would say is, we know that we want to have some combination of bonds and notes. I would like to keep the Great Island portion as notes for the reasons that we discussed, and do the HHR and the other various projects as bonds, because there's not some of these other considerations about taxable, some unknown, we haven't spent all of that extra 6.5. We don't want to bond it if we're not going to spend it, those kinds of things. So I want to keep Great Island as notes and use the other projects as bonds, and still have that combination.
And just to be clear, in 2025, we showed the terming out of all 49 million of the bonds for 30 years. And that's just a modeling construct, because we may yet have the taxable issues still pending at that point in time, and we'll make a decision as to how much bands and how much bonds then, depending on where we are with the information we have.
Correct. Every year when we do an issue, we're going to have this same conversation, and you'll have the say on the structure, the amount,
Okay.
all of that.
We also had, the model shows a 3.8% 30-year rate, but it shows it in 2025. What's the current rate?
That is the current.
That is the current rate?
I didn't mark up for next year on the long term because of the inverted curve. I
All right,
felt,
so so you're saying that the yield curve will steepen by facto of the short end declining to make it non-inverted?
Correct.
Going forward? Okay, got it.
I'll admit, I don't understand all of the reasons that we want to keep it short. Is it primarily because we think rates are going to be lower next year? I don't understand the phasing in, because it counts as debt, right, short or long term.
It does, but your debt service is, so if we were to bond $70 million, this year. It's not going to have much of an impact on debt service in fiscal '25, but all of that 70 million, even if we defer principal the full 3 years, all the principal on that 70 million is going to come in 3 years from now. Whereas if we do 30 million of it as bonds and 49 as notes, that 49 doesn't have a deferred principal because we're going to do something with it the following year. So only the principal of 30 million comes on in 3 years. And then if we bond the 40 million next year, that comes on 3 years from there. So you have the principal from the 30 million coming on in 3 years, the principal from the 40 million coming on in the 4th year.
Okay.
And so it's not for the immediate next year, but it's for in the future 3, 4, 5 years as this rolls on.
We've typically done our long-term bond issues as like 2 years of interest only. And then the 3rd year it pays its first principal. So we pay principal then down over level debt service. So this just pushes out the
Okay.
time in which we issue our first principal payment.
Got it. Attachment 1 shows you all of the amounts that we're looking to issue. Like I said, the biggest on the bonds is HHR. What I'm looking for is about 10 million per school, and that's to reimburse for what's already been spent, which is about 1.5 million on Hindley and just over $1 million on Holmes, 1.2 on Royal, plus the construction, the estimated construction cash flow for the next year. Soft costs aren't estimated, so the expenditures could be more, but if they exceed what we borrow, we have the general fund that would front the cash, and then it would get reimbursed when we do our next issue.
And there may also be the timing issue of they'll start submitting the costs to the state for reimbursement from the beginning of construction. And it's just a matter of how and when the state chooses to make those payments. My understanding is they could be making them during the construction period.
Yes, they did for Oxbridge. We
Okay.
got periodic payments, so that would also help us with cash flow on
Right.
the project.
So this 6 million left in Oxbridge, two questions. When do you think we can close that out? And we haven't had an Oxbridge building committee meeting in months. It's all punch list stuff, et cetera, cleaning up some invoices. But A, and B, do we have any timing concerns about using that authorization for other projects?
So Oxbridge, I think we have about a $1 million cash surplus at the moment, but we are awaiting another state grant payment. I don't know how much it's going to be. So we'll have a little more than $1 million cash surplus. Until all of those invoices are paid, we can't close it out, but I don't expect all of those final invoices to total more than the $1 million that we have right now plus whatever this state grant is. So the closeout would be to move unused bond proceeds over to another project. Say they're even in the realm of $1 million, we can move it over to HHR and have to borrow less on HHR in the future.
But is there a deadline on when we can make that transfer?
It has to be within 5 years of when the funds were issued. And I think we did the last Oxbridge issue in 2022, so we
Okay.
do have time.
Thank you.
And if we reallocate funds over to HHR or some other school project, do you need an opinion of bond counsel?
No, it's a bond counsel prepares the resolution for you, but the resolution comes to you and it just says you're going to move $1 million from this issue to.
No, I just meant under the terms of the prospectus from the issuance, is there a requirement? Because in the prospectus, it's going to specify the utilization of proceeds for the issuance. And if we issued specifically for Oxbridge, do we need an opinion of counsel that it's okay to move the funds to a different project?
Council
instead of
prepares the
Oxbridge?
resolution that moves those funds.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Is there a reason we're not bonding the anticipated 12 months of expenses for Hanson Road Bridge?
I was just trying to keep the cost down. We don't have a time consideration on that one because we're just starting to spend and we get pretty much up to 3 years from the first expenditure. And there is the possibility of a state grant on that. So I think because we don't have a time constraint, we can hold off on that. We have the cash in the general fund to pay the bills prior to borrowing.
And Jen, just in terms of term here, you know, obviously the Great Island ban would be a 1-year ban again, right? Which to remind everybody, pays interest at maturity, not at, not during the term of the bond. But if we're going to do bonds on HHR, I think we need to have some opinion around what the term is, or we can, right, we're allowed to do school bonds out to 30 years, but but generally this board has not wanted to issue bonds beyond the useful life of, in this case, the renovations.
Is there an estimated useful life of the renovations? Is there an opinion on that, or is that just a judgment?
I think that that's a judgment. Yeah, I don't know that there's a hard and fast.
Right.
But I was going to actually ask about that, because if you look at the debt service curve, by modeling HHR all being issued at 20 years, we kind of have a cliff at that point in time. So say, for example, we were to issue some portion of the HHR at 25 years, it would actually reduce the near-term debt service and sort of flatten out the end a little bit. I don't know, is there a difference in rate, or is there like a minimum size that you have to do to be would we be able to split the 33 million of HHR bonds between 20 and 25s, or does that's too small of an issue for the market to do it that way?
You could. I'm not sure you're going to really, it's not going to materially change the curve of your debt service, because what you're saving on that first principal payment is going to be probably eaten up by added interest.
So we think
debt service.
if the 20 years at 325, if my recollection serves, we think the 25-year is significantly higher?
340, 350.
The term structure is upward sloping, but the issue is that the rates are going to be, the blended rate will be a little bit higher, but the first couple of years we're only paying interest, so it's a very, very small increase. It's just the extra basis points of the slope of the curve, but.
Okay.
And I just went back and looked at an email from bond counsel, because we did ask about going beyond 20 years on the renovations, and tax law limits us to 120% of the useful life of all projects that are financed with the bond issue. So I think the general feeling of people is that renovations are a 20-year useful life, so the max that we could term out is 24 years.
But I think we don't want to be in a situation like we were at Tokenique, where
We're still paying on it
we're paying
and
on
then doing
bonds,
more
that's
work.
what tearing it down,
Okay.
which these renovations are going to last for 50 years.
All right, it's not going to be enough to make a difference, but that was just something I saw.
A couple other things that I want to call your attention to is we got into the pro forma, attachment 4, showing future debt service. And I just wanted to point out that using this model, what happens to our debt service? Current year, we're about 13 million. We drop down to about 12.5 next year. Then it does start going up in fiscal 26. We're at 14.7, fiscal 27, 16.7. And we end up at 18.1 in fiscal 30, and we stay there for about a decade. Then our debt service starts to come down again. And then what we're looking for from you today is approval of the resolution to sell, which you have in your packet, which is the amounts. We want to just get your consensus on structure, level principal versus level debt service, deferred principal, that kind of thing. And then we need you to designate a representative from this board to attend the sale.
Before we get to that, sorry, go ahead.
Go, David.
No, I was just going to ask, I noticed that in the assumptions, we assumed a 3.5% increase in the budget for the cash flow projections, but clearly this year we're going to be coming in substantially above that, and the outlook for the next couple of years is probably well above that. So do we think that the 3.5 captures enough for the cash flow forecast?
That's really to show you where our debt service is relative to our budget. So if the budget goes up more, then debt service will be a smaller percentage of the budget.
Okay, got it. But relative to the aggregate amount of debt outstanding, it's not going to be a material difference, is what I'm thinking.
Right.
Okay.
On the material level of debt outstanding, on your document, pages 9 and 10, our debt burden peaks at 1.49% in 2027. In our debt service, as a percentage of expenditures, peaks in 2027 at 8.7%. Do you have a reaction to those levels vis-a-vis other AAAs that you deal with? And, I mean, I know you're not here to give us a ratings hug, but just any kind of feedback on that?
No, astonishingly, adding $100 million to your debt, there isn't much concern. The magic number people used to think of as 10% carrying charge for debt. So you're below that. It's not really. They also throw in pension and OPEB for those numbers now, but you're still below that carrying charge. You're not over leveraged per se. And then with your grand list, 1.5% or 1.49% is significantly below, the concern level. So you'd have to be over 3% to really be over leveraged as a percentage of your grand list.
Thank you.
To get to a point where it's like a statutory limit, I mean, there's massive.
Well, you're not even close to that. Yeah, you're not even close to your statutory debt limit.
Well, we're not encouraging getting to that.
No.
Good point. We would frown on that.
But these levels don't concern me.
Thank you.
I think if you look at getting up into the upper eights, okay, in terms of like 8.6, 8.7%, that's generally in line if you rewind the clock sort of 18 months when we were putting together our projections in terms of where we thought debt service could climb to. Accounting for Oxbridge, for Great Island at 103, and for HHR at, a little bit less at that point.
But it's not like there's not other projects coming. Has it all been accounted for?
Correct.
No, this is only accounting for what we know of right now.
Right.
What is authorized and getting us through financing most of what is authorized.
But we're financing roughly a third of HHR.
Right.
So we have 2/3 of HHR left, in addition to whatever else might come down the pike.
And that is, the
Built in.
2/3, the other 2/3 is factored into here. This gets us all the way through.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Fully
that's right.
bonding
That-
HHR.
These ratios reflect it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But not middle school, not high school, not
Correct.
flooding, not any of that.
Right.
Can I revisit one extra thing? I noticed that in the Great Island items that we have laid out for potential, expenditures going forward, there's nearly $400,000 in legal fees and consulting fees. Are those the kinds of things that we want to be bonding, or should we be expensing those?
Where was that?
On Great Island, we've had a lot of.
Item 4.
Oh.
Item 4, the revised sheet that was passed out tonight, there's $344,000 of legal fees and $79,000 of consultant fees. I would typically think of those as operating expenses that should go against current period versus being capitalized.
I mean, I personally view those type of expenses the same as when we do like other sort of large building expenses. We have lawyers, we have architects, we have, sort of all consultants helping us design those programs, and we bond those over, like in the case of Oxbridge, over 20 years. In the case of HHR, we're choosing to bond all those. But David, to your point, and looking at our exhibit, our attachment 1 here, there are a couple of these smaller things. I think, maybe Jack and others had raised a point about whether some of these smaller projects, we should be using some of the excesses that we have in our general fund, and just looking at some of these as like a portion of new sidewalks which were about 20% of the sidewalks that we built in 2020, and some of the town hall upgrades and so forth. I think
Yep.
maybe this is also in context of our overall budget discussion about whether some of these smaller capital items that we could bond,
Yeah.
but having the amount of proceeds that we do now in our general fund, can we?
Yeah, gotcha. Then the road and fire department conversion, yeah, that was another one too.
So on the new sidewalks, the town hall gym upgrades, the 75,000 and the 70,000, those are currently just as notes. So if you wanted to not bond those and just pay for those out of the general fund, we would, when those notes mature, that would just kind of get paid back. We don't have to issue them as bonds if you want to use general fund for that.
Yeah, but we are kind of locking in 1 year of,
They're already, they're coming, they were already
In the bands.
in the bands, so they are maturing.
If we approve this authorization, we're locking in bonding
20-year
this for
bonding
another
on
yes.
those.
20-year, not, yeah.
Right,
20-year
because
bonding on
they are
this. This is
proposed
part
for
of
the
bond.
33,000 or
Right,
33 million
right.
bonding.
so if we didn't want to update, bond the gym upgrades or the sidewalks over 20 years, we could take those out and just fund that
Correct.
from the general fund, because the appropriation for those, just to remind everybody, right, it's both an appropriation and a bonding resolution. So it's sort of our choice
Right.
as to whether or not we want to bond or take it out of the general fund.
So we could do that, and I was thinking about that. Apply some of the general fund to this instead of reducing the amount of bonding. But then when it comes time for the capital projects discussion as a part of this cycle in the budget, we won't have as much dry powder to put toward that, am I correct?
Correct.
So we're gonna be asking for more taxpayer contribution through the mill rate. I mean, this is not moving the needle, like,
Well, I
Well,
agree. It's not
let-
moving
let-
the needle.
let's be clear here. We have $10.9 million excess reserves above the 12% threshold that the board has, set. We were going to have a broader discussion about what's the right level for that as part of the general budget process.
I think we've always discussed a 12% as our minimum.
Yeah.
That's when it gets to there, it needs to be sort of brought back up, but our target's always been generally in the 15%
Yeah.
when we're thinking about using funds, but there's still a lot of money above 15%
No.
right now.
Completely agree. I'm lobbying for us to set a formal operating level versus minimum level.
Does it make
But
sense,
if-
given, I mean, these aren't going to move the needle. They're already in the proposal for tonight to bond. Personally, I think we should leave them in the proposal tonight to bond, but I think this budget cycle and every budget cycle thereafter, we should minimize the burden on bonding by using every available other means, including, our excess.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Fund balance.
That sounds right, Dan.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I generally would like to kind of get the bigger, longer-term capital projects being bonded, and some of the smaller, like a gym upgrade, maybe not being bonded.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, good.
But we already made that decision on these
No,
projects.
yeah, I
We could
got it.
reverse it tonight,
Well,
but.
we could
but-
just decide to pay for it cash
And,
and
it's-
therefore
it's-
roll less debt.
Right,
But
it's not. it
it's
doesn't
already
move the
in there
needle.
for tonight, like you said, it's already in there for tonight,
and
and
we
it's small.
can
so,
debate
yeah.
using 2 million, 4 million, whatever, when we get to the end, and that's gonna make a big difference for the mill rate, but it's not gonna make a big difference if we do that.
Yeah, I got it.
Right,
I
exactly.
think the total of the
Exactly.
non-ARPA capital projects, I don't have my file open, but for this year between Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen, is that close to 4.5, 5?
About 4.5 if you disregard the $1 million that's proposed to be bonded for the fire truck.
So 5.5 with the fire truck.
Yeah, 5.8 with the fire truck, 4.8 without it.
So there'll be plenty of opportunity to pay down capital things from other sources.
I guess what I would say is like this year, we'd be limited, we probably would not spend more than that amount there,
Yeah.
right? Because we're not going to spend on operating.
So I think you had said we were going to the resolution, and I said before we get there, or somebody did. So we're now there?
Yeah.
I think so.
Sorry.
So are you comfortable with the structure as it is laid out in the pro forma, the 20 years on, 20-year term on the bonds, deferred principal, and level debt, right?
Level principal and interest, yeah.
So I just have one question on the HHR bonding. Like, the first principal payment needs to be within 3 years of the issuance of the bonds, or from when the first dollar was spent
From the
related
bonds.
to the bands that you're rolling?
So April of '26, you need to make the first principal payment.
So you can do ban, and then do bonds and still wait 2 more years
Yeah.
to, so effectively you can roll the principal for
4 years.
to 4 years of paying your fifth.
Yeah.
Okay, so structure, we're good?
Yeah.
So you have in your packet the resolution to sell, which is very heavy. And the last item on that is that it further resolve that the Board of Finance names whomever as the designee for the purpose of this sale. So we need a name for there.
I nominate Jim Palin.
I second that nomination.
All in favor?
What day are we doing this?
Most likely August,
April
April
9th.
9th.
Are we busy that day doing anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay.
You gonna be away?
I think that's the night of our budget vote, right?
The budget vote, right, it's gonna miss the budget vote.
Okay. Accept. And to be clear, this is just a bonding resolution, so this doesn't go in front of the RTM.
Correct.
The
This
RTM
is
already
just
approved.
your resolution authorizing us to sell
Yep.
the bonds and notes as proposed. You want to read it?
The whole thing?
Or you can just say as presented.
I'll accept the motion to approve the bonding resolution in attachment 5 on page 4 of our packet to sell 49 million of the 103,465,000 bonds of the town of Darien authorized to be issued for the purchase and improvement of approximately 60 acres commonly known as Great Island shall be issued and sold as bond anticipation notes. And the balance of it will all be sold as bonds.
Bonds.
Good.
So,
33,045,000.
so I'll accept that motion from Dan moved. Dave seconds. All those in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous.
Be efficient.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, the next item is to discuss and possibly take action on a request for a special appropriation from the Board of Ed for the purchase of school buses, and I believe it's also wheelchair accessible vans and Suburbans in the amount of $850,000. So we have a memo which was sent to the Board of Selectmen in our packet. I think I sent it around to you guys all, an updated and a second updated version of it, which had some sort of changes in the some of the assumptions and so forth. Jill or Alan, do you guys want to say a few words on this?
In case you have any questions, I'll have the brain trust. Okay. Yes, so as you're aware, thank you for having us tonight. We're requesting an appropriation of $850,000 to purchase 9 new special education transportation vehicles. If approved, this would enable the district to fully run its own special education transportation. The district began with 4 Suburbans in 2016, currently runs 6 Suburbans, and would like to would like to start the 24-25 school year with 8 Suburbans, 2 wheelchair vans, and 5 Type 2 buses. This would enable us to serve all of our students who are eligible for and elect to receive special education transportation, ELP through high school and beyond. Some of our students are over 22. While not included in the appropriation in front of you tonight, we are also planning to build up some operational capacity. You've seen that in our budget numbers. That includes 9 drivers and bus monitors and 1 transportation coordinator. We are off-cycle requesting an appropriation because we'd like to issue our purchase order in April to make this happen in a timely manner. The appropriation was approved unanimously by the Board of Selectmen last night and was also preemptively approved by the RTM, Education, and F&B committees, also unanimously. While there is an initial capital outlay, going forward, we expect to save over $500,000 in operating costs yearly. Not only does this restructuring make financial sense in a multi-year period of increasing budgets, next year's current forecast is already around 5.5%. This makes a meaningful difference to our ability to serve students in other ways. $500,000 is the equivalent of 4.5 teachers, approximately the amount of the gifted program district-wide, equates to about 6 paraprofessionals, and is a little more than elementary world language. It is also about the cost of the security initiative that we have just implemented. We filed 2 applications with Planning and Zoning yesterday, the first to increase Suburbans at central office and the second to park near our Fitch program. We'd like to put the additional Suburbans over at central office, having a total of 8 over there, and the remainder of the vehicles, we're looking at a lease over at Thorndale Circle. Planning and Zoning is confirming the process and what levels of approval are required there. We would need the parking locations to be determined by the end of July and believe there's ample time for that. We would be expecting to receive delivery of the vehicles in the beginning of August. We received the email from your chair and aware that this is not your preferred timing. You'd like it to be a part of the budget. We understand that we have different roles and wish to respect your preferred process. However, when we look at the timing and the level of operational effort, we continue to feel that issuing a PO in April is the right timeline to ensure that 1, we're easily able to require the requisite vehicles, 2, we get them at the optimal price, and 3, we get them at the optimal time. We would also prefer not to add additional time or complexity to the acquisition process for the sake of this program and the sake of the impact on other district operational matters. We believe that continued analysis is possible, and there are some things that we're happy to discuss, but the overall economics are sound. We remain grateful for the work of our town partners to date. This effort has required time, attention, and work from all the boards and committees assigned to review it, and we're appreciative of all of those efforts. We ask that you consider this appropriation and consider it tonight. Thank you. Do you have any questions for us?
So I have a couple questions to make sure we're sort of understanding like the origin of this. So the 2 Suburbans that are in this, one is an incremental Suburban and one is replacing another Suburban?
No, there is actually still a Suburban in the capital budget. We're going from 6 to 8 Suburbans.
So the Suburban that's still in the capital budget, when do you intend to actually order that? Is that to be used for next year, the same as these 2 Suburbans?
So the one that's still in the capital budget is to replace one of the first Suburbans that was purchased in 2016. So there really is no time crunch because we have the Suburban and it's still operational. So assuming it makes through all boards and it gets approved, we would seek to purchase it sometime in the summer and then take offline that existing Suburban in the fall.
And so these 2 Suburbans were originally in the capital budget. So why were they taken out of the capital budget and moved to a special appropriation?
We decided to package the whole thing together so that everybody could see the entirety of the effort. We moved from just a small incremental increase to a larger operational change, and we wanted to package that as an entity.
If you use the substitute driver, do you still pay the one that didn't show up?
So there's, so the one that, it depends if they take a sick day or a personal day, they would still get paid. We have an assistant that's proposed who would have to have a V endorsement, which is the endorsement you need to transport students. That person would already be being paid, so that person would not get any incremental pay over and above what they're being paid.
And how did you come up with the insurance costs?
So we did reach out to our insurance consultant. We also reached out to a couple other firms that use these type of vehicles to get a ballpark in terms of what they would be. Suburbans were already insuring, so we have a good baseline for that. So we did reach out to kind of get firm estimates that we could have.
Well, on insurance, so if there's, God forbid, an accident, where does the liability for that accident sit today, and where would it sit if we approve this?
So with the Suburbans, if a Suburban were to get into an accident, the liability is us. Obviously, they have auto insurance. The district has liability insurance as well. If one of the type 2s, for example, that currently First Student runs, they obviously have insurance, and then we'd have to go through their insurance. If we purchase them, again, it would be similar to the Suburbans where the liability is on us.
And the same thing with the wheelchair vans?
Correct.
Thank you.
Can I just ask the number of Suburbans, the number of type 2 vans and the wheelchair vans, that's the same count, if you will, that we get from first student currently?
So first student for the wheelchair vans and the type 2s, the Suburbans are primarily used for out-of-district transportation, and we
Right.
use a company called Safe Transportation and then Connecticut Transportation Solutions.
Okay. And how do we know that the number of type 2s and wheelchair vans is the right number? For instance, the number of students served today, there's an average of 107, right? But there's a number of students served today, which I believe is above the average, right? And so it sort of feels like we are planning at peak as opposed to planning at a normal level. And secondly, do we know that the routes that first student uses are optimized? Things like the type 2 vans, do they show up 20, 30% full, like the regular school bus that runs down my street? Or do they show up at 80% full, which would justify the need for a van as large as a type 2?
Sure. So we've had the same number of type 2 vans and wheelchair vans for a number of years, over 10 years. The ridership does fluctuate based on need. First student doesn't actually do the routes themselves. The district does the routes and provides them to first student. There's a number of things that could depend on why you have a certain amount of kids on the bus. It could be what's determined in the IEP for the student, the length of time that the student can be on the bus. So all those, and then obviously the tier that the student's on, depending on what school they go to.
Plus, I would add the program that they are served by and their approximate geographic location. So, because of course we have kids who use those vans all during the day, starting with our high school or earliest in the morning, or maybe the kids who go out of district early morning, and then as late as our latest elementary schools.
So most importantly, the district already determines the routes now, so it would be the same.
It would be the same process.
Going forward. So, Rich, yesterday you mentioned that one of the reasons we don't get any other bidders besides first student is that we historically have had no place to park the buses. We have no place to service the buses and no place for a dispatcher. But it strikes me that under this proposal that's put forward, we have all of those things. So if we have all of those things, what do we think first student's price would be?
So we don't have all of the things. The biggest obstacle really is the home-to-school transportation, which is those 72 passenger buses that you see. Those are the difficulties.
Well, but we're not talking about replacing those. Those are not included in this package. We're
Correct.
just talking about
But
that.
that's what's determining what companies will bid or not bid. So when a bus company bids, they're bidding on the entire package. They're bidding on home-to-school, they're bidding on special education, they're bidding on athletic field trips, the whole thing. And so what ends up happening over the last 15 years, with the exception of this past year, the district has only received one bid, and that was first student, because they do rent a lot in Stanford. We did receive a bid from Durham, who services Norwalk this year, at a cost of 40% more than that we're currently paying, with the caveat that they'd have to be able to find a lot that would not be guaranteed, which basically is a non-bid. So even when we go out in the future, we're likely still to only get that one bid because of home-to-school concerns. The reason special ed is, more reasonable to do is it's obviously less vehicles, it's less students that are transported.
Okay.
So I have a question. I mean, when the board discussed this briefly during the budget season, there was no discussion around whether we should take a deeper look, like we have hired consultants to look at other areas to see if there might be a better option to buy 4, operate 1, buy 3, operate 2, or whether or not it's possible, and what the effect would be in terms of timing, number of students, cost, around trying to consolidate any routes. And when you're looking at ridership, what is the average number? I think you mentioned last night that 4 times a year they report back in terms of the average number of riders on routes.
So we do a census 4 times a year, so typically 2 in the fall and then 2 in the spring to kind of get an idea of how many kids are actually riding the bus. We do tend to see more kids ride the bus in the colder months as opposed to the warmer months. We have used outside consultants to look at riderships and routes and whether or not we're optimized. I mean, a good example is we ended up actually pulling a bus from the Holmes area and moving it to Oxbridge when we saw that significant influx of student at Oxbridge. There really isn't an opportunity to get rid of a bus at this point, short of changing either the board policy or student needs significantly dropping off. At this point, based on the tiering of the times for the schools, the ridership and the needs of the students, 5 is really what we need to make it happen.
Does the board have a policy in terms of what the maximum bus ride can be? I know a lot of other districts have policies like this that they have to operate inside of.
So there's no formal board policy, but we do try to keep special ed routes around 30 to 35 minutes, and then the general education home to school routes typically no more than 50 minutes.
5-0?
5-0.
Thank you.
And do you have the average ridership on these buses?
Do you have that census information that you?
Yes.
Per bus? For these, is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
Per
you take the
type
census
2?
twice. Yeah,
So
you
4
can-
times a year, so we did take it twice in the fall. We haven't yet done it in the spring. We'll probably do one in March, and then we'll typically do one towards after spring break.
I think that information would be helpful, at least to, I think. Why?
The only thing, if I could push back a little bit, is that there's some, just structurally, it's difficult to optimize because you are mixing a group of people who are, it's only a certain group of people who are going to hit that age limit going to that program at that time. So I think that, yes, you will always want to look at it, but I think that it's a little bit different than just looking at the geography.
That's fair, but we're not a bus company, right? So we don't, and I understand that we've been running transportation within the school district for years, but I don't think we pretend to be experts on busing, because we've, or maybe I'm wrong, but.
Our transportation coordinator came directly from First Student,
Okay.
trained there.
All right.
So
why is New Canaan, so New Canaan attacks this very differently. They attack it in your memo, 28 suburbans. Ridgefield attacks it differently. Glastonbury attacked it differently. There don't seem to be anyone other than those 3 districts that are moving in this direction. Can you comment on why they're doing it their way and we're doing it our way?
So New Canaan made the decision to only use Suburbans. They didn't want the larger type 2 vehicles, the 28 passenger vehicles. So they're accomplishing it the same way, but they have more headcount in order to do it. So if we were to follow the New Canaan model and let's say not get the type 2 vehicles and only do it with Suburbans, we would need to about double the amount of vehicles, which means double the amount of drivers, which means double the amount of overhead. So that was a conscious decision that New Canaan made. Partly because some of the roads in New Canaan are narrower. Glastonbury made the decision a number of years ago to effectively just run a bus company. So they purchased the 72 passenger buses, the type 2 buses, the wheelchair vans. They hired a fleet of mechanics, a safety team, a director, 2 coordinators, and they are essentially their own bus company. And that's the kind of direction that they've gone. That is more rare. I will say for Ridgefield, they've only kind of started to dip their toes in the water in this field, and largely because the superintendent in Ridgefield used to work in Darien. And so they've started to they're probably where we were in 2016 to 2020, and they're trying to slowly implement that as well. A lot of districts in their area have seen significant increases in the cost of busing. And not only that, they've also seen significant problems with being able to staff. They've made a lot of districts have made changes, midterm in their contracts. And so what we see, if we look towards like a Westport, they made a change and now they can't actually park the buses anywhere. So if you go to Westport, they have buses at the train station, they have buses at the schools, they have buses on the side of the roads. If you look at Newtown, they ended up in a situation where they didn't have enough drivers and they were sending email blasts out to parents saying, sorry, you got to bring your kids to school. We've been lucky in the sense that we haven't had that. And we do have a good relationship with First Student, but we're paying a significant cost for that. And so, obviously we have budgetary pressures. We looked at any other areas that we could have efficiencies in, potentially save money. We started looking at some of those contracted costs, and really transportation came in at that. At 12.35% in the first year, it's one of the largest increases in Fairfield County for transportation.
So I guess it's getting at my concern, which I think you just touched on a little bit, Jill, which is this is a better model. The math that you've done suggests, or maybe makes the case that this is a better model. I don't know that I'm yet convinced that this is the best model. And maybe you can help convince us tonight, but I'm not yet convinced this is the best model, and once we buy this equipment, we're kind of locked in. It's a 10-year decision, and we're hiring 16 people. It's, I don't know, 12, 13 FTEs, because I think some of them are part-time, right? So, I mean, that's a big decision that binds us to this model. And the question is it the best model?
So I do believe it's the best model. I believe if we followed the new Canaan model, the overhead costs associated with that would not necessarily be worth it. While it might be more convenient to be able to park a Suburban than a Type 2 bus, it's a big difference from having 9 extra drivers versus 18 drivers, right? And then not only that, maybe more monitors as well, because now you can't have one monitor with multiple kids. You know, one of the things that we see, especially with special education, is, you know, sometimes the needs change rather frequently, and sometimes we might have to get a wheelchair van out immediately, or we might have to, you know, pick up a kid in a location that we weren't necessarily anticipating. And when you use a company like First Student, while they're responsive, you don't always get that immediate satisfaction and that operation, you know, executed as quickly as you would like. Being able to operate these vehicles ourselves, we would be able to do that. It does lock us in for, you know, 10 years. You're going to own these vehicles and you're going to have these drivers for a while. Transportation is not going away. I mean, we're required to bus students. It's not something like we have a program and, you know, a couple of years down the road, they're going to tell us you don't have to worry about busing kids. You know, transportation's here to stay for, you know, probably forever. And so while there are a number of different models that you can operate, I do think for this population and for the type of needs that the district has, this layout would serve the community well.
I think the experience that we've had with the Suburbans before, I think, has played out positively. I will say that I think this is something we may have considered 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but with the experience we have with the Suburbans, with the personnel and so on that we have in place, with the drivers that we have in place, I'm confident that this is the next incremental step. We're not looking to become a bus company. That's not what we're trying to do. But I'm confident that we can execute on this next level.
Well, just, I guess, when I look at this, we actually don't save any money this year. In fact, in the highest ever budget year, okay, between debt service, Board of Selectmen budget, Board of Ed budget, this adds $560,000 to a year when we're already looking at drawing down the general fund for other types of capital projects in order to minimize the effect on the taxpayer in the context of a revaluation year. So this actually increases costs, right? And it's a little bit odd, I think, in terms of how it's being brought to us. We're being asked to kind of look at the capital, look at some of the stuff that'll sort of change a major operating initiative and other stuff that's just kind of part of the regular budget. And, you know, I'll pause for a minute and I would say this is exactly what we're supposed to be looking for. And I think, you know, based on the numbers that I've seen, there's a lot of questions I think you've heard from this board, and I've emailed you all that I think we want to see additional information. I'd like to understand what the actual ridership is. Is the board policy 6 kids per bus or 8 kids per bus? Or I mean, there's got to be a policy somewhere, like we have a class policy, I assume.
Not for this. This is a different cohort. This is determined by IEP. So yes, we could set a range, but you don't, for example, set a class size policy for kids who are in a special education classroom, because that is bottom-up IEP determined. So this is a very different cohort. It doesn't follow the same kind of optimization. Yes, when you get your cohort, then you're going to try to optimize your route, and if you've got at the high school or the middle school where you have a larger number of kids, yes, you're going to be looking for how you can do that most efficiently. But it is not the same thing as a class size policy in this case, because it's not determined in the same way, and you've got much more unevenness, as Rich is saying, over time through the school year, in and out, and just the nature of the cohort.
But ultimately, there are routes that are scheduled, just like on the larger 70-person buses,
Yes.
with a certain number of people on them, and you have that information, right?
Yes.
Okay. So then
I'm just saying you're not going to set a limit in the way you would a class size policy.
you set it based on other things.
Right, because you know.
And then I guess, you know, in terms of as we think about adding more FTEs, I think what we're hearing, what we heard in public comment is healthcare costs are skyrocketing. When we look inside the Board of Selectmen's budget, the two largest and fastest growing things are the contributions to a pension. So this adds all new, at least on the full-time basis, additional employees into our pension program. And while we don't necessarily pay something day one for that because they're reevaluated based on the employee population every year, we're taking on that cost, regardless of whether we start paying it today or 12 months from now. And I didn't necessarily hear at the board table any real discussion around looking at the quantum of extra FTEs that we're taking on, the healthcare expenses that we're going to be inheriting for the next, if we're going to own the buses for 10 years, and the pension costs. I didn't hear any real discussion around whether, like the decision that the board made to allow the SSOs to move on to defined contribution plans rather than defined benefit plans. I didn't necessarily hear any of that discussion at the board table. And I think a little bit to Dan's point, I think this is a great initiative to be looking at. And I think you've at least to date proven that there are savings here. I guess the question is, are we capturing, by buying these buses, this quantum of buses and the operational changes that you're looking to make, are we capturing all the available savings that we can? And so my view is, say, having spent a lot of time on this, and speaking to you all, I know you all spent a lot of time on this. I don't necessarily know that right now on May 12th, March 12th, I'm necessarily ready to make that decision in terms of a large capital outlay, which then precipitates additional operating expenses without knowing more about how this is going to work and whether there truly are a lot more savings that are available or less savings.
So you're truly concerned about the pension costs and the impact on this, is what you're saying?
I think what I was saying is I think there are a lot of additional operating things, from how we compensate our employee partners, whether through defined benefit or defined contribution, the quantum that we use, whether we go with buying all of these vehicles or a portion, how we think about designing route structure. I mean, I would expect this would be sort of a holistic discussion around, including up to the point where it's not just the type 2 buses that are increasing by 12%. My understanding is that all of the type 1 buses, the 70-person buses, are also increasing by 12%. And over the last 10 years, spanning 2 contracts plus a 1-year extension, they've increased by 80% the cost of our busing. So I do think, this is good. Those type of costs, just 47% over the last 5 years, our busing costs have gone up. The cost per bus, not counting the fact that we have more buses, right?
So I see that concern differently. In my view, this is an opportunity to actually scale up in a modest way. We've scaled up a little bit. Now you're scaling up a little bit more. We're looking at the operational impact of what this size of busing, and that cues us up to have a more robust, more informed discussion as we prepare for the next bus contract in 5 years' time. I actually think this is a perfect opportunity to make a bigger decision in a couple years' time.
What power do we have to negotiate with them, given that you can show this amount of savings every year? I mean, is this set in stone?
With what, the bus company?
Yep.
So they're not willing to budge on their prices. I mean, one of the things they've experienced since COVID is a dramatic increase in the amount of pay that they've had to offer bus drivers and recruitment bonuses, and now they're passing those costs on to the consumer. We went back and forth for a while. They also know, for us, they're the only game in town. They've known that for a while.
But we could certainly take revenue away from them by doing this, so they probably have an incremental interest in staying with it. But I also wonder, why is our experience hiring so much better than theirs?
So, I mean, the town pension does play a role. I mean, some individuals do take pay cuts to come here. We're very fortunate in the fact that the director that we have, as Jill mentioned, was a former First Student employee, and she has a lot of contacts throughout the state to recruit drivers. We've also pulled drivers from Norwalk Transit as an example, and some of these smaller outfits that do out-of-district transportation. We don't wait for the applicants to come to us, where you post an ad and hope a lot of people apply. We're proactively going out and, for lack of a better word, poaching people to make sure that we're staffed.
And are there situations where IEPs call for more than one monitor per bus?
Not at this point.
Rich, these drivers are not part of any union
They are.
group, right? Okay, so the
Could they become part of a union?
I mean, anybody, I guess, could choose to try to unionize, but they are not part of a union and haven't been.
Are the first student drivers part of a union?
Yes, they're part of the Teamsters.
Thank you.
Yeah. And do the first student drivers receive a defined benefit?
So they are grandfathered out. So some of the drivers that have been here for a long period of time, including those who work in Stanford and some neighboring communities, do have that. And then over time, they've moved to like a 401k style.
So we are doing this both programmatically and also fiscally, because it impacts our operating budget as well, right? That we want to reduce it by over $400,000. And Mr. Chairman, I respect your discussion and the discussion of the board, but I also, you said it's adding to this year's budget. Yes, but we would never bring something forward that wasn't going to result in a payback. In isolation this year, yes, maybe it is contributing to a bigger budget overall, but there is a relative short turnaround in that what we're going to be realizing as part of the same picture. And I think this is what, certainly as we're talking about the board and we're talking about ways of realizing efficiencies and improving programs too, this was one way to do it. And I also thought that this was something that would actually be receptive and received well, or relatively well, conceptually at least. But I understand the details.
Dr. Adley, I think searching for cost savings in any portion of your budget and just determining how you optimize your transportation, your teaching, your administration, I think all of that is very powerful, and I think it's, I think Rich and you and others have done a great job sort of pulling this forward. I don't think what you're hearing from this board is any question of whether this is not something we should actively pursue. I think the question is, on March 12th at 9 o'clock, do we feel like we have listened to you all, investigate all the possible avenues in which we can diligence the savings that we're expecting, you know, the $500,000 savings here, whether that can be increased or whether that we should be accounting for other things like some of the new analysis does, like in terms of including retirement benefits.
That's right.
I don't think that precludes your capital decision, just saying. I think that the operating, not the operating, I think that we can talk about retirement benefits and what the best model is for the drivers. I still think this makes economic sense.
So I don't think you're hearing from us that it doesn't make economic sense.
Okay.
I think what you're hearing from us, is it the optimal model? And is it the best model? And Rich, you did a good job explaining it, how it's different from the other towns. But it can't be or maybe it is the only model. Is it the only model that makes sense for Darien? But there's been no kind of like, well, we could do it 3 different ways, and this is the best of the 3 different ways. There hasn't been that kind of discussion or analysis, and I think that's kind of what we're looking for. Plus, fully making sure that the analysis, and a lot of work's been done in the last 30 days on the eve of this meeting and last night's meeting, but maybe there's a little bit more work left to do before this board votes on it.
And I personally would like to see that work include the art of what's possible. Are there parking or maintenance facilities, if they're not in town, are they outside of town?
So
With the brunt of this transportation budget still going up 12% this year, right? Because we're not touching the type 1s, and 7% every year thereafter. And on top of that, we pay fuel and so forth, so that's not included in those increases, but I would actually like to see all of that really evaluated. The same way, I think you guys, this is a great example of looking for savings. I think we need to see if we can find more and really double click on this to make sure that the way we're going to run it.
We did
is
look
optimal.
at potential lots in Stanford to park buses. The cost of renting was really prohibitive. It was about $13,000 a month for the 2 lots that we looked at. So those were not really viable options.
Is Tokenique still the most viable option?
So I think the Fitch property at this point is,
But that's a 1-year lease.
at this point, correct.
And that, my understanding is that property is for sale. So that may not be a longer term option.
I think there are other options that we have talked to planning, zoning, and the Board of, or the First Selectman about pursuing in the future. There is, for example, the lot over by Post 53 that is state-owned, and that might be an option. So there is a feeling that there is probably a way to find parking. This isn't so many vehicles at 7, but there probably is a way to find parking, and that there is a time to figure that out. But at a minimum, we know we have a year with Thorndale.
If you said that's 30,000 a month,
13,000.
13,000 a month to park all the buses?
It would have enough to park about 15 buses, 15 to 20 buses. I mean, it was not a huge lot, but it was 13,000.
Well, if that's 13,000 a month, not per bus.
No, 13,000 a month, just the rent.
So that's like $150,000 a year?
Is that in the numbers?
No, we didn't explore it past the.
But if we can park all of our type 1 and type 2 buses in the
No,
place.
no, not the type 1. So the type 2s, the wheelchair vans and the Suburbans, if you want it. It's not large enough to park at type 1.
So that's kind of, the 500 becomes 350 or 375 when you include that cost of parking.
We're not going to pay that cost of parking.
Correct. We're not looking to end up renting.
No, I think-
Okay, fair point, fair point, not that, right, but there's some amount of cost, there could be a cost to park that would be a deduct from the annual savings going forward.
So if we end up parking at Fitch, it would be $6,300.
And that doesn't look like it's included in the.
No, we're waiting for P&Z to.
But again, that's a short-term option, that may be just a short-term option.
I think it's fair to say the cost of parking these handful of buses are relatively de minimis in terms of the overall outlay, and you have a few different options for this. But I think the point was, we should be looking elsewhere to see if there's a way that we can take the largest portion of this budget, which is the type 1s, that's increasing 12% this year and 7% every single year thereafter, and 90% over 10 years. We should be looking for a solution for that too.
Sure. I would think that it's likely not going to be a solution we can find by July. First Student does have to sign their lease for their property. They don't own that property. In Stanford, they're leasing that property and effectively passing on that lease cost to us.
You're referring to longer term, a year or two out. You're referring to longer to a year or 2 or 5 out when you say looking bigger picture. We're not going to ramp up that much. I'm asking to confirm what your time frame is that you were speaking to.
I think for this step right here, I think there are a lot of questions that were asked of this board.
I understand. When you were talking about the larger buses, what is the time frame you were referring to just now? Not
In terms of
July.
evaluating it, well, if there are massive savings involved, I would say we should evaluate it as soon as possible.
Okay. It's a 15-month period to acquire a 72-passenger bus. So, we certainly can. We would just want to discuss what the appropriate time frame is.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I appreciate all the work that you guys have done, particularly the work, the staff and so forth over the last 24 hours and last week and so forth, but I guess my recommendation is that we have a bunch of questions that are still outstanding. Our original proposal was to look at this, in your timeline in connection with the overall budget process, and look at this and have it, likely with the addition of more information, aim to make a decision in connection with our vote on the 9th with the overall budget.
So just so we can get ahead of it, what are the questions you guys wanted? I have some questions about defined contribution versus defined benefit. We're giving you some of that information.
What I can do is collect the questions from this meeting as well as the other ones we've sent across, and in the next kind of 24 or 48 hours, get them all.
You want the
across to you
ridership.
all, and grab one of my partners here to kind of help work directly so we can get all the information.
And just to be clear, I think while you said at the top of the meeting you'd like to procure these or issue a purchase order in April, the timeline in the memo actually is an April 9th Board of Finance vote on this. So we're not inconsistent with, I think, what was requested in writing, right? So.
Perhaps.
Well,
All right.
Well, Jack, if you'd like to ask a question when Jill's done, we'll invite you up here. You can ask a question so everyone can hear.
Do you just want to speak to the trade-off between, it's not impossible, but do you just want to speak to the concerns over why we are asking tonight for tonight?
Sure. So as of right now, we know that the buses are available through the cooperative. They're not going to hold the buses, obviously, until we issue a purchase order. So the more time that goes by, the potential of the likelihood of the buses being available shrinks potentially. Doesn't necessarily mean it will, which is why our optimal timeframe would be as soon as possible. But obviously, the later you issue it doesn't mean it can't happen. It just adds more variables to the equation.
But we're likely faced with a similar situation next year if we waited, right, or next, whenever.
So we likely wouldn't do it next year. We're likely not going to end up terminating a portion of the contract while we can with first student.
Contract?
Deferring this till April 9th isn't going to put
Correct. No, right.
next year at risk.
No.
It's a little awkward with first student, it compresses the timetable a little bit, but you can still work with that time.
Yeah, we wouldn't end up having to essentially terminate that portion of the contract before.
Thank you.
Yes.
Rich, am I correct that what I'm hearing is that theoretically, if we defer till April 9th, it might be possible that all of the buses wouldn't be available through the cooperative, and we may have to purchase one or more
Correct.
through some other source, which could be more expensive.
Correct.
All right.
And take more time because we need to go through a bid process.
And we're really certain that if we go to them and say we're going to terminate a portion of this contract, that they won't be willing to negotiate.
No.
You're
But-
sure? Yeah.
But Rich, to be clear, the 5-year contract that you've been working on, and I understand like that's what sort of precipitated a lot of this analysis here. We have the ability sort of any time to sort of, with a certain amount of notice, to pull out of.
So you do have the option of 60-day notice to essentially pull out. The concern with doing that, and we've seen it in other communities, when you make a large-scale change like that, they've made investments into purchasing new buses because there is an average age within the fleet. They're making a long-term commitment for them to lease the property. So when you make those changes, it does tend to lead to the bus company saying, well, I'm going to now start moving drivers from Darien to Westport or Darien to Stanford, and then you create a slew of operational concerns where maybe you can't staff the home to school buses as well as you would like, or athletic trips as well as you would like. So maintaining that relationship with first student is as important as any term that we have in the contract because we don't have alternatives. It's not like we can say within 60 days, okay, you haven't fulfilled, we're gonna go hire STA or DATCO or something like that, because they're just not willing to come here.
And I just note that during COVID and all the subsequent time periods, we haven't missed it. Now, they haven't been perfect, but we haven't missed a beat. We haven't missed a day of school or otherwise because of transportation, bus drivers not showing up, not being able to get enough buses. They have served us very well in that regard.
And is this likely at all to upset the apple cart with them?
If you rock the boat completely, like and pull out during halfway through the year or something, or that would potentially impact the operation of it, what Richard said about bus drivers and so on and so forth.
But taking this businesses away from them would
So
not.
it's not quite for them, the moneymaker that home to school is. So I think they have an inkling that we're exploring things. But losing 7 drivers versus losing 25 to 30 drivers is much bigger. For them, they can take those 7 drivers and plug them in Stanford, who was short 40 drivers last year, and be able to help another account.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Jack, you had a comment?
Yeah. Jack Davis, 197 Point Street. I'm just looking at the time frame, and while I appreciate the board wanting to do it as part of the budget on April 9th, let's now talk about some reality. Next RTM meeting, if we're not voting on it next Monday, is April 29th. We're not meeting before then. While we try to set up a motion to have a virtual meeting, there's no guarantee because the following time to make the April 15th date is during vacation week. So I can't even guarantee we would have 50 people online. If you add 10 days to that, the soonest that they would be able to put in an order would be May 9th. So that would increase the cost of the buses. That would potentially guarantee that we cannot do this. So while I appreciate the more information, the way F&B looked at this in education was ultimately there are savings. So if you want to quibble of whether or not something is here or there, there's so much savings that we're only talking about whether or not it's an 18-month payback or a 2-year payback on return on investment. But there is a payback here, and it's significant. So this board can choose what they have to do, but unless the RTM is going to vote Monday without this board's approval, which is not necessarily something I would recommend, we have to understand what the time frame is here. So I think that's an important part for this board to understand as well. This is savings. The biggest question we have is, yes, you've been running Suburbans. Yes, this is new. I understand that people would prefer to work for us than smaller companies. I don't think there's a negative next year. We're talking about cash flow. And one of the things that I haven't been hearing in even the earlier discussion, which is what F&B's been talking about and other members of the RTM, is that yes, if we have cash, we should pay down. But there's another option. The option is we can tax our taxpayers for capital projects, or if there's ones we don't like, we can reject them. The fact of the matter is that based upon the other things that have been going on, ARPA bonding, cash coming back from our boards, and in fact also the fact that our grand list has grown, that has generated $1 to $2 million extra. When I look at what the costs of the operating budgets have been for the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education and our capital requests, they're much higher than what our mill rate is. F&B's been saying we cannot just look myopically at a single income statement, but we have to look long-term. We have to look at the balance sheet. And to me, this is a no-brainer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Well, so, yes, the original timeline, as Dan referenced here, had this coming, us voting on the 9th, not going to the RTM on their meeting, Jack, you said April, when is it?
29th.
29th, if people show up. If not...
No, that one, people will show up because it's the end of the month.
So
we can't just do a virtual meeting between you.
So the original schedule had us voting on the 9th and then going to the RTM voting on it simultaneously with the overall budget on the 13th. So my vote would be for us to organize the balance of our thoughts on paper that we discussed tonight and other questions that we had for Jill and Dr. Adley and Rich related to this, sort of the operational capital side of this, get this to them, continue to move it forward with the expectation that we can make a decision as they had originally requested on the 9th. And recognizing Jack's point, I think one of the reasons that we discussed the value of doing it on the 9th is we can look at the entire balance sheet. What is happening to the overall mill rate? What do all the budgets look like? How much have been moved to ARPA? What does the grand list look like? And make a decision sort of holistically. So.
Jim, just respectfully, the timeline does say the 9th. The paragraph above does talk to an April ask as well. So we have been a little bit inconsistent, but our ask from the beginning was April. Our understanding from you guys was that you preferred the 9th. That's why it shows up that way in the timeline. It is our preference. I get it. You got to make your choice, but it is our preference that it be April.
Okay. Which I'll make sure we get questions to you, and obviously a lot of these are operational questions, which Rich is kind of tackling nonstop, but some of these may be actually questions for your board, so I'll make sure we have them ahead of, so in case this is something you want to discuss with the overall board, any of these questions, but we'll get them to you quickly.
Can I just be clear on the timeline? If we vote on it on the 9th, when does the RTM vote on the budget?
The 29th, and then we have 10 days wait before they can actually use that purchase order.
So that pushes the
May
ability.
9th is the soonest they can go out.
May 9th would be the soonest you could go out. And Rich, does that trigger any deadlines for you guys in terms of the ability to buy from the co-op? Because I thought that there was like a window.
So it depends on how long, if they have the vehicles available. I mean, that's what would become the issue.
So if this was a separate matter, if we voted on this as a separate matter on April 9th, then that's the timeline. If it was part of the budget,
It
then
doesn't matter.
then it doesn't matter?
No. The
Because
fact of the
this
matter is-
note says that your budget vote wouldn't be until May 13th.
Yes.
No, it has nothing to do with our budget vote. If you put it as part of the budget, then in fact, we would be voting on it on May 13th.
That's my point.
And then the soonest they could buy it is May 23rd or 24th.
Yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make. So if we vote on this as a separate matter, then you can vote on it at the RTM earlier.
Well, the fact is that since it was on your schedule today, had you voted on it today, we were voting on it on the 18th, which is Monday, which would have allowed them to meet their April 15th deadline. So if you vote on it on the 9th, I could try some magic to try and do a virtual meeting, which I've already set in place, to see if we could have a virtual meeting of the RTM and vote on it in April at some time. The question is we'd have to try and guarantee we have 51 people there during a vacation week. But if we're doing it virtual, people can call up from their ski resorts or wherever else they might.
So Jack, there is no RTM meeting scheduled for April?
29th, we had to move it back because of
Okay,
the
so
holidays.
yes, on the 9th, we can do two things. We can keep it as a special appropriation, which will then move it, you would assume, to the next RTM meeting, which would be April 29th. They could pass it or not pass it, and then become effective 10 days later.
Or they
On-
can
on our
accelerate
April-
that 29th.
Or they could accelerate the meeting.
Awesome.
The alternative would be to put it into the capital budget, which would then not allow
Push it
them to
out
vote
even
on it
further.
until May 13th. It came to us as a special association, so.
Our first selectman.
John,
Yeah.
what do you got, Mike?
And I might say, there is something else we can do. We can vote on it, since both of the RTM committees and the Board of Selectmen have recommended it, on the 18th, and then we're just waiting for your vote. That is an option.
That's their decision, right?
If you put it in the budget, the appropriation does not become effective until July 1st.
Right.
Yeah.
Unless we do like we've done in the past. But John, you want to talk?
Just wanted to make three quick points. The first one was, why did we approve this last night? So I spent quite a number of hours on that spreadsheet and talking to these guys yesterday and went through it. I didn't cover some of the questions that you are posing, but what I did look at was the overall economics. And I tried to answer the question, what would you have to believe that changes the answer? So if you look what the answer is, we've got an $850,000 outlay up front, and I forget what's the negative cash in the first year, it's $600,000 or something. If you put that out over just the 3 years that we have in the memo and then the spreadsheet that we did, those 2 out years are $500,000 in savings. But that's not even the length of the 5-year contract. You could tack on another $500,000 in each of those years. That's $2 million in savings versus the $600,000 sort of net outlay up front. So when I looked at all that in the aggregate, I had to say, what could I possibly believe that changes the answer as to whether this is a good idea or not? And there's no realistic combination of assumptions, even 2 and 3x fuel costs and maintenance costs. And we even assumed in the updated analysis that every single driver takes health insurance, for example. So that the maximum possible cost you could have on that. And when I looked at it, there's simply no way, that there's no change that you can make in those assumptions that makes this a bad economic deal. That's the first point. The second point is that there's a number of components that we're talking about here that would be nice to explore to try to optimize, but ultimately is not our purview, right? So how they pay people, or whether they want to put them in a defined benefit plan, or what salaries they want to pick for those drivers, that is not within our purview for us to dictate to them. We can ask questions about whether that's optimal, but even things like bus routes and whether certain students are on there or the number of students are on a bus, That's way outside our purview. Certainly for us in our role in looking at this project and for yours, we can ask questions about how that's done, but that is not our call to make. We have to make the call about whether this is a good financial deal or not. Last point that I would make is we've had instances in the past where we've had to get an appropriation in place before things were settled, and we have done that on school projects. So what you'll do is we'll run through an appropriation, and poor Jack has to go over there and recommend a $60 million appropriation for a school, and he's got nothing, right? He's got an overall plan, but basically he's got nothing. He takes that big checkbook and he hands it to a building committee, and he had to do that because we can't actually get bids out unless there's appropriated funds. So these guys are under timeline pressure. I think it's good for you guys to pose these questions. I don't think the answers to those questions are going to change this analysis or change the decision that I think we should make on this. I do think there's validity in these questions in the sense of sharpening things up or trying to understand why they got to certain decisions, and maybe through a dialogue encouraging them to say, hey, from our perspective, this could be done a lot more efficiently over time, and to raise that with them, and maybe you can talk them into that. But you have to talk them into that. If they don't want to, ultimately, they don't have to listen to those types of questions. So one thing you might consider tonight is to say, vote to appropriate these funds. I think that you could go through a process over the next month or two, and I don't want to speak for them, but I'm pretty sure they'd be willing to answer these questions, and they might actually tweak some of those things based on your advice as the elected finance board to say, look, had you thought about some of these things? Maybe this can be done a little less expensively or more efficiently. But you'd be able to do that without actually having to put pressure on whether they can get the vehicles on time, where they can start to think about drivers and hiring and getting all that in place now as opposed to potentially waiting till May, whatever, based on his RTM schedule. So it would take pressure off that decision when we know up front, at least this is my assessment, that no matter how you change these assumptions, as inefficient as we may perceive some of their internal processes that might be, this answer does not change. This is a good financial deal. That's it. Thank you.
John, I think you bring up an interesting point, which is it sounds like what I sort of heard from what you said is that over the life of the 5-year contract, it's a $2 million savings. So there may be other.
The last 4 years have added up.
Yeah, I got it. It's negative 600 the first year, 2 million over the last 4 years. So net, it's still $1.5 million even net, right? So the question is, do we think there's any scenario under which any of the optimization ideas that we have asked about would generate $1.5 million or more, right? Because otherwise, your point is correct. At the end of the day, this decision is still the optimal decision economically.
So I would modify that a little bit. Because the decision we are being asked to make is to authorize the purchase of specific number and type of vehicles. That locks us into a model. So, which is why I think it's perfectly within our domain to ask about the nature of the payback on that investment. Because that's the argument that's being made. The argument that's being made is that if we spend $850,000 now, we're going to get a payback. So I think it is our job to make sure we understand what that payback is and whether it's accurate, whether it's fully loaded, and whether it's optimized. Because once we vote, and if the RTM votes as well, then we're locked in to the number of and type of vehicles. And personally, and you guys know a lot more about it than I do, but personally, I'm not yet convinced that this number of and type of vehicles represents the best that we can do, and we're locked in for 10 years. So I'm not suggesting that there isn't a payback. I'm saying this is locking into one future when there might be a better future.
This locks us in
with a different mix.
This locks us in for 10 years, right? And what I did not hear, and again, a lot of times we make the decision after the operating board has gone through and vetted all of the questions and discussed sort of policies and so forth. So, we're trying to learn by asking questions and help make this decision. Is 7 the right number of buses to be buying? Is it 6? Is it 5? Is there other stuff? You know, I'm not convinced yet. So,
Mr. Chairman, I just say that fiscally, that your questions are all applicable in your domain, and that's fine. I'll just say on operationally, that I'm confident that we can execute on the operation of what we're describing. If there's any concern around that, if there's fiscal questions that come out because of the extension of it or how long it's going to go on, that's understandable. But if anybody has any questions, look, I may have parents behind me who have the same concerns about having a middle school team. At some point, operationally, you got to trust that we know what we're doing on the ground with this stuff. The play out of buses and how that impacts, that's all okay. I mean, I understand all that. But at some point, operationally on this, I'm convinced that I wouldn't bring it to you if it did. Again, I wouldn't have brought it to you 2 years ago. I think you've always said, come when things off cycle, on cycle. Here we are. And fiscally aside, if you have any worries operationally, I just say you put those aside because I'm confident that we can execute on them.
well, I think in some of the other changes you did propose during the budget cycle, I think you gave a lot of explanation, rationale, backup data, reports in the back of the budget book and so forth, and at least made me better understand it. So I will thank you for that. So as it relates to this, our choice is either to make a motion tonight, vote on it, or move it to a later meeting, which would be on the 9th in connection with our vote on the budget.
I would ask that we defer the vote until the April 9th.
I would second that motion. Is there any discussion?
Can Jack perform his magic?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I'm not sure. I think your question is, can the RTM vote on this and approve the appropriation of dollars without the Board of Finance? I don't think so, but I'm not.
Haven't they done it before?
Well, sorry. Let me differentiate the question. The RTM can definitely vote on it. The question is, maybe for Jen, does the appropriation become effective if the Board of Finance hasn't yet voted on it?
No, it doesn't become effective
Okay.
until 10 days after all three have.
So,
But it becomes effective once we vote on it on the 9th, because if they've passed it.
Yeah, I think that would be an option, is that the 10-day I would defer to Jen on.
I would defer to Wayne because
Yeah, I'll call Wayne tomorrow.
I think that it's 10 days after all three have approved.
So then it'd be April 9th plus 10.
Right.
I
so-
If the
believe so.
RTM has already voted yes.
Right, because they need all three, so I don't know in this case whether or not it matters what the order is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if it doesn't matter what the order is, then you guys voting on the 9th, providing it's dealt with as a separate item and not as part of the budget,
Correct, yep.
that would work.
Yeah, I think we've done bond authorizations out of order and done them pending Board of Finance approval, but that was with the okay of bond council.
I think there's.
I don't know if we've done special appropriations on it.
I don't know, but I know that there's been times in the past when John was the chair that F&B has voted on something saying, we approve this appropriation, and if you take it out of one of your funds, that's fine. If you do a special appropriation, that's fine as well. At certain times to just give cover to the Board of Finance so that people aren't snipping at the heels saying, oh, they did it without somebody in the RTM looking at it.
Okay. Well, then, Jen, could you work with Wayne and just determine how that would work? But I think right now the motion on the table is whether to push this to a later meeting, being April 9th. So we'll get you an answer on whether they can vote first. Any other discussion items on this? Okay. All those in favor of tabling this to a later meeting, being April 9th, say aye. Aye. Okay. Those in favor of not pushing it to a further meeting and voting on it today? Okay. So this will be pushed to discussed at a future meeting. Jill, we'll get your additional data and questions that we're looking for, and appreciate you guys looking into this, and I think this is a good start. We just have more questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a good night, guys. Yeah. Nope.
Okay. Next item we had is to discuss the budget.
Not so fast.
I did hand out to everybody supplemental, the handwritten item 6 on it, just to give you a couple of data points on the budget. We don't have any specific budgets to discuss tonight. We'll begin those reviews on March 26th, but this just gives you the same story you've heard last week. Total operation expenses up 6.06. Net amount to be raised by taxes for operations is up 5.57%. Capital expenditures up 24.12. Net amount to be raised from taxes for capital is up 156%. But then so overall total tax increase, total amount to be raised through taxes is up 7.29%. But then I did add in some data on the grand list. Right now, we don't have the Board of Assessment Appeals adjustments, but they are expected to wrap up by the end of the month, so we will have their numbers early in April. But just comparing, this shows you the comparison from the final 2022 after Board of Assessment Appeals to where we are now, broken down by real estate, motor vehicle, personal property. So overall, the grand list is up 24.63, but there is some variation in those changes. It's pretty much all in real estate. Motor vehicles down a little bit. Personal property is nearly flat. And then just a couple of items on capital to keep in mind. The fire truck is in the Board of Selectmen budget on both the expenditure and revenue side. So there's no budgetary impact on that one because we're assuming bonding. And then the last thing on this sheet is just those items that the Board of Selectmen removed from the budget and that you approved to be funded from ARPA.
Jen, one question I had on this was on the grand list. We show real estate going up by 26.3%. Anthony and Millie and the team there and I did a lot of work in connection with the state of the town. When we looked at this was before the Board of Assessment Appeals, this 6,800 properties in town were going up by, on average, 29%. And so that must mean that the commercial real estate was going up by a smaller percentage. Do you think you could work with him to try to break down real estate between sort of commercial properties and residential properties? Because I think one of the things to realize when you look at the bottom, with the overall grand list going up by 24.6%, 25%, with commercial real estate, with residential real estate being up 29%, more of the tax burden is being shifted away from commercial properties onto residential properties. And while it's offset a little bit by motor vehicle, that's relatively small, but whatever the overall tax increase that we approve from a dollar perspective, which I think, Jen, in the model without sort of allocating from the general fund, we were showing a 7.3%, right? That's going to have a greater effect on individual homeowners' taxes than 7.3%.
Do you have an estimate on the surplus from the town? I know it's an estimate.
It's
so
a
we're not going to hold you
estimate.
just for context.
So I would say 3.5 million.
Wow.
And that's mostly coming on the revenue side. About 2.3 million of that is from investment income, better than budget. And maybe 600,000, 500 to 600,000 is on the expenditure side.
And while we have you here, Rich, where are you on the school side?
So the last report, we were a deficit of about 230,000. We expect that to shrink to probably close to about 150,000 deficit.
Thank you.
I assumed 300 because I want to be conservative.
So but that 300, is that in the 3.5?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, all
So,
right. So
already we're likely better than that.
Yeah, more like 3.6 or 3.7.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Jim, I thought I understood this before you started talking, but effectively the increase in commercial real estate has gone not less than 29%, it's gone from 0 to whatever it is. So why is that going to hurt?
So if the overall real estate, both commercial and residential, is up by 26%, and residential is up by 29, it just means that real estate has to be up by less than the average.
So therefore, the reassessments or revaluations were lower.
But I think with commercial real estate, effectively every year, every October, they need to submit their information.
It's a little different than on the 5-year reval.
Yeah, they don't, those are almost updated pretty much every year, right? Because
Right,
Anthony's
right.
looking at sort of the net income per approach on these properties and so forth. So it just means that if the average is up by 26 and residential is up by 29, you probably have commercial up by like 5%. It just means a little bit more of
Got it. Thank you.
the tax burden gets shifted,
Yep, I got it.
to the homeowners.
So last year, Jen, did we, the 2.6 million that we used from the fund balance, did that equate to the surplus that the collective boards generated? Approximately, it was approximately.
I think it was a
right?
little less. It was around what we were projecting at the time.
Right, because it's inexact, right, because
Right.
we're 2 months ahead of time.
And I'm always going to be conservative.
Right.
I
When
thought we
we're
took-
deciding how much to pull from.
I thought we took a discount to all the surpluses that we thought
Right.
were coming back, and then we added money out of the general fund. But I think in the end, the surplus, the
fund balance, I think, grew
It went,
by more, the
Yeah.
result of operations was better than what we pulled from fund
assumed
balance. Yeah.
to pull from fund balance, right, okay.
So we actually didn't pull anything from fund balance, because it was more than offset by investment earnings and
So
budget.
reserves
that-
went up again.
We did, but it's like, but net, it went
Yeah.
up, it
Right.
still went up, yeah.
So Jen, is it right for me to say, if we're gonna have a $3.5 million surplus, combined between the Board of Ed and the town, right? That if we applied the full 3.5 million, then the fund balance projection that we have would remain unchanged?
Well, except that it would be a smaller percentage of the budget. So if we were, say we're at 17.5% of a $164 million budget, we're going to be less than that on a $175 million budget.
The denominator is
percentage.
growing.
Yeah.
The denominator, right.
Yeah, but we're
still
at like 18.7% currently.
Right, but all I'm saying is if it's 30 million and it remains 30 million as a percent of the current budget is a larger percent.
I
than
got
30 million
it.
of
So
the proposed budget.
even though the dollar amounts would appear to be fixed, the ratio would be lower.
Correct.
I think one of the things we need to think about is if in total the Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen and Capital are 5.8, including the fire truck. And so therefore, if we were to bond that, which we may or may not, right, but that would bring it down to 4.8. If we have 3.5 of surplus that we're rolling over into capital, that means, generally speaking, we'd only be taking a maximum of 1.3 million out of the general fund, out of our kind of excess surplus. So, depending on what happens with like the buses and so forth, because that would come out of the general fund, right? But I think as we think forward, because capital is what it is, maybe that is a reason to consider buying a fire truck rather than bonding for it. Because otherwise, we're only bringing that down by 1.3%, and that doesn't really maybe that takes us from 19% to like 18.5%, but it's not a big change.
But I do just want to caution, we're adding a lot of debt. There's talk of, can we extend the term on our debt and pay down a little slower? We're talking about drawing down fund balance. Those are all three key areas that Moody's does look at. So while it's not concerning that we're adding $100 million of debt, we don't want to have markers in all of the negative columns of the criteria that Moody's looks at. So I think we do need to look at the whole picture and make sure that we're not pulling too much on all of those areas.
But if we're adding to, if we're running surpluses, I thought that Moody's felt that if we use some of that surplus to offset capital for the ensuing year,
Absolutely.
that's not using using fund balance to fund operating deficits. That's really bad behavior, right?
That is horrible behavior. We definitely don't want to do that. But, so we've created a trend of we use our excess surplus to put into capital, which is a great way to do, because in theory, those are one-time expenses, but every year we have one-time expenses. So we are, on a continuous basis, subsidizing our annual expenditures.
We are, yes.
For things that are of a one-time nature. So I just want to make sure that we keep that in our mind. I'm not saying that we can't pull a sizable amount from fund balance, but I just don't think we want to go too far with it.
But I think if you look at the sources, like last year, we put 2.5 million more than we anticipated into the general fund because the budget came in. So, you know, it's a matter of really using this year's surplus, and if you define it as using last year's surplus, which just never ended up getting used.
And I think if we come up with maybe a policy or guidance on our approach to how we use that. So if it's, you know, we use 75% of the March 30th projected surplus into the next year's budget. You know, if we have some kind of a method that we use, I think that's a little more palatable for Moody's, and I think it's a little more structure around our decision making, and I think it can also, part of this is when the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed put their budget together, no one can make an assumption of how much you're going to put into capital, but if you have guidance on that, then the Board of Selectmen can say, based on this guidance and where we are in a projection right now, let's assume 75% of the January projection goes in, and we would have less of a headline because we know this increase is not going to be 7.29% because there will be a contribution from fund balance. So if you have guidance on that and the Board of Selectmen can factor that into their budget, we can avoid some of the sky is falling when it's really not, because we know once it gets to you, you're going to be able to put a big chunk in there.
Can we differentiate the growth each year in our grand fund, in our general fund, by breaking it out between sort of budget surpluses on the expense side versus kind of revenue surpluses, and look at actually how it's growing? Because the general fund's not growing from like us selling assets and throwing proceeds in there, or it hasn't grown from at least any intentional year where we've actually taxed to put money into that. It's always been a result of excess revenue, or
Yeah, the last couple of years has been a result of primarily vacancies on the town side, and so we can go back a couple years, and then going forward, we can start tracking it that way.
Yeah, it's nice, when we're in budget season, it's great to have an excess surplus to apply to next year's budget, but we shouldn't be generating surpluses, because if we're doing our job right on the next year's budget,
we should be a lot closer.
We should be a lot closer, because we're taxing people, or we're funding that
Correct.
surplus. We're just, yeah, so yeah, we don't want to get in the habit of.
Or if we have the policy.
And the other
just
thing
bring it
is,
back in.
divorced of how we fund it, we still need to be focused on the absolute growth in operating budgets, right? Whether it's a 6% budget that we can turn into a 4% tax increase, it's still a 6% budget or an 8% budget. That's still, we still have to get at that why are our budgets going up 6.5%, 7.5%, 8%?
And
that's really the work we have to do in the next 3 weeks.
And I think the sizable contributions, I want to say it started maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we were able to contribute enough from fund balance to eliminate the need to tax for any capital. But now you're year over year, you're comparing to a zero that first year. And then, you know, oh my God, that's a huge tax increase. And again, it was getting, I think it's not artificially low tax increase, but it's.
Yeah. The rate of tax increase
It's
is lower than the rate of
growth or
spending growth.
something, yeah.
Right.
Well, we made switches from funding fire trucks, right, for a reserve, $500,000 per fiscal year,
Exactly.
to bonding them. And so those type of changes, and I think kind of getting back to which, you know, points which others which Jack has made, some of these smaller things, like $75,000 type payments, should we be getting back to, even though those are bondable? In many cases, we would pass a bonding resolution just in case, but we have the power to just say no and pay for it out of the general fund.
Jim, if I might add something, and I'll speak loud. The problem with what we were adding to the fire engine fund is that one year we would put in the 500,000, then it would be a tough budget year, and we weren't putting it in.
Yeah.
So there
And then we were
wasn't,
behind.
and then we were behind, so we were $1 million up the other year. So while we had what appeared to be some straight line to some magical number, we weren't committed to it as if we were paying off a bond or a loan, so we might as well just bond them. And the fund would have grown. I mean, one of the things, well, F&B is not in favor of bonding these smaller things. One of the reasons why we're still in favor of the fire engines, especially with what's going on now, is 1 year out, we pay 25% when the chassis is built, and then we have to wait another 2 years before we're even gonna get it. And if we just say we're gonna pay for it, that's $1 million that's sitting in the reserve fund for capital non-recurring, which is allocated fund balance. If we say we're gonna bond it, we take the money out of the general fund. When it comes in, depending upon our situation, we just need to do an appropriation, and we can pay the thing off, because as you said, Jim, we approved this appropriation here, and then bonding the appropriation here, and we just join them together for bond council. But we've already appropriated that, and it keeps out assigned fund balance, which is not as favorable as having unassigned fund balance.
I agree, we can use bonding resolutions as a bit of a line of credit.
Right.
And then when it does get to the point, we can take it out of the general fund if we have sufficient.
And the other one was sewer, because that's a contained area, and so that way the general taxpayers are not subsidizing those that are hooked up. And for information purposes, I am hooked up to the sewer. So, so if we're bonding those people are actually paying for any of the improvements that Ed's been doing.
Okay.
Well, why the fire truck is not an ARPA expense? The timing?
The one that's proposed now?
Yeah.
Yeah, timing, because it can take up to 2 years to take delivery.
Okay. Well, we'll end on the note that the sewer is a contained expense.
While we're on the budget, is it too much to ask that we can set the schedule for when we're reviewing the departments?
Yes.
Because I think, we're coming up to those dates. It's the
March 26th.
It's 2 weeks from tonight.
Yeah.
And then it's a week later, and then it's the Thursday after that.
Yep.
Right? Those 3 dates, we need to start coordinating with our RTM.
So I will reach out
pals.
to you guys all, like in the next couple of days here. We'll get that scheduled. Let's try to consolidate it to the extent we do need any staff beyond Jen. We'll try to consolidate it in a way where if the same staff needs to talk about multiple items and try to consolidate our discussion around the Board of Ed so that you all are here, not every night.
We should try to have that done no later than the end of the week, because we'll only have then a week to kind of pull our questions together to give staff enough time to get back to us.
Okay.
So, thank you.
So next item is the review and close out of the capital projects and reserve fund for capital non-recurring expenses.
So this is the same format we usually use. You'll see all of the projects to be closed and then all of the projects to remain active with an explanation of kind of where they are, why they're still ongoing, when they expect to be complete. What I am looking to do is close out projects that have remaining balances totaling $70,579.67. And if we add that to your Board of Finance reserve current balance, which accounting for the motorcycle request, you would then have a Board of Finance reserve balance of $428,524. So if you have any questions on specific projects, we can deal with those.
The only comment I would make, and without getting into specifics, is that some departments seem to be much better at estimating their project cost than others. So we ought to endeavor to make sure those departments that are kind of maybe putting a finger in the air, to maybe go an extra step so that the actual cost is close to what we authorized. Closer to what we authorized.
I will say, if you look at what we are closing out,
Yeah, that's where I'm,
the bulk of it is coming from the Board of Education. And,
most of it's coming from the Board of Education, but
and Park and Rec.
look, if you look at the percentages in the Board of Education, they're, the amount they spent is 90+% of the amount they asked for. Other departments are closer to 50%. Too frequently. Too frequently. Not all the time, and not on average, but too frequently. They asked for 15,000 and they spent 7. So why did you ask for 15? What went into the request for 15? That's what I'm getting at.
Okay. We have improved our capital request process, and in the last couple years are requiring them to provide quotes. But we can see what we can do to improve that.
Well, we've shrunk the small capital accounts, right? Now it's more like sort of line items.
It's not the small
No,
capital,
those-
it's like, it's the other,
And I think historically we've had that concentrated in one department.
Yes, it appears that it's one department.
Yeah,
Yes.
but yes, we will look at that.
I think that was the only question I had. This is a lot of, it's a lot of spreadsheet there, Jen.
Yeah, and I will say, Public Works has a lot of projects that I would have liked to have seen finish up sooner, but I think they've had a lot of things moved onto their plate that weren't anticipated at the time they received these appropriations, particularly ARPA projects, Great Island projects. So I think Public Works will get these done, it's just taking a bit longer than it normally would have.
But generally, and I remember doing this over years past, the projects that are closed out aren't necessarily going back 5, 6, 7 years.
No,
all
they're much
They're much
better.
closer now. Right. So, Jen, do we need to vote on this?
Yes.
Okay.
You'd just be voting to approve the projects as presented and move the 70,000 into reserve.
Okay, so I will accept the motion to close out projects totaling $70,571.67 and move it into the Board of Finance reserve account, capital reserve account. Dan moves, John seconds. All those in favor? Unanimous.
On the financial report, taxes are consistent with the prior year, which is good news. We'll actually see that coming in a little bit faster because for the first half of the year, this was the first year where we were splitting taxes and making a contribution directly into the capital fund. That is now, we've hit the budget for taxes on that, so 100% of the tax revenue will be going into the general fund now. On investment income, now that we have the February statements, we are up to just over $3 million through February. The projection for the year is about 4.1. And then the only other item on revenue, building permits, our budget included 407 for redevelopment projects, and so far to date, they've taken in 536 on those projects. 536,000. And on the expenditure side, everything's tracking as expected, and right now on legal, we are expecting that the regulatory counsel line will have a pretty sizable surplus on legal expenses. The last thing I wanted to call your attention to on expenses is the very last one, Board of Assessment Appeals. And this is something that I want to just do in the budget when it comes to you. It was a single line item for overtime. Through an administrative transfer, we've just collapsed that into the assessor's office rather than keep it as its own org and its own budget. So in the fiscal 25 budget, that's just something that we'll do, is move that around and get rid of one little separate division.
Jen, when do they need to have all that done in terms of the appeals?
I know that Tony told me he's expecting to have it wrapped up by the end of the month. I don't know when they're required to have them done.
Okay.
When you say wrapped up, does that mean all the meetings
All the
done?
hearings are done, and I think then they're able to quickly turn around the numbers.
Thank you.
And you can ask them to break out the real estate, right, by
Yeah.
commercial?
Yep, we'll have that broken out for you.
Thank you.
I mean, elsewhere in the report, and I apologize if anybody printed it. When I went to print it, it printed really funky for me. So if anyone else had problems with that, I apologize. I don't know why I did that. But I really don't have anything else to highlight. Active bonded projects, once we do our bond issue, this will clean up a little bit.
Jen, on the contingency, anything else coming up on that in terms of using, not using?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that the police department is going to have they're working on getting quotes for some building items. It could be a sizable number. I think it's going to end up being a capital need and not an operating need. And there's definitely sufficient in your capital reserve to cover the kinds of numbers that they're talking about, but they haven't been able to pull together all those quotes yet. But
And
we'll
the
put it together.
contingency we can use for both capital and operating, right?
We can, yeah, because we can move it into the transfer to capital.
Yeah. And we use it for Board of Ed or,
And Jen, those things you're thinking about for the police department are things that would be in this budget year?
Yeah, they're pretty immediate.
So they're immediate as opposed to, could be
Working
postponed
into-
until
yeah.
August?
I think we're waiting to get the quotes from them and what the vendors recommend on, if something can wait or needs to be addressed immediately. So we don't have all that information yet.
All right.
You ready to go? I'm done. It's all packed up.
On the current running deficit for the Board of Ed, I really appreciate if it's brought before the RTM, because I want the RTM to buy in, to understand what went on, because it does help them understanding what's happening in the budget, because a lot of this is special ed driven, and that's one of the drivers in their increase in their budget. So while if they get it down to 100, under 150, yes, there's money in the Board of Finance contingency, but better thought process, since we just did 26,500, is to move it as a special appropriation, bring it back to the RTM.
Yeah, we only have like 148 in contingency
Yeah,
anyway.
you don't have a lot in there.
yeah, if they have a surplus, but we won't know that until
Yeah, right.
we get into June.
Yeah, but they had 800 last year, and you're not getting it this year. And that's with using 200 to pay down equipment.
Great Island acquisition, there is a little more detail. You got a handout that said item 4 on it, because I was thinking it would kind of work along with the bonding discussion, and then attachment 2 in the bonding discussion gave you a little more information. They both talk about kind of that extra $6.5 million that we borrowed to do the access, what we've spent so far, bidding time if we know it, expected costs, that kind of stuff. So it gives you a little more information on that. And then there was the question last meeting of if we rescind the bond authorization, does it also rescind the appropriation? And I confirmed with bond counsel that yes, because there would be no identified funding source. So if you take away the bond authorization, the appropriation also dies.
Which means it's a Board of Finance decision.
Yes.
We don't need
It only
Board of Selectmen.
Right. All the decisions that we've done, I've asked her multiple times, because it seems strange to me, but she has always told me it only needs Board of Finance.
Jen, but how does that work with the discussion we just had, just using the fire truck as an example? We passed both a bonding and an appropriation rev.
Because what you would have to do is approve the way we did it was, I think we approved a transfer from the general fund to the bond fund. Because you're not you could do a new appropriation, but you don't need to do a new appropriation. You're just identifying a new funding source for the appropriation that's already been authorized along with the bond resolution.
Because usually these, you're appropriating it and you're allowing for the bond authorization to fill that, but it doesn't prevent you from using.
Right, you can use other funding sources.
Yeah, and the RTM sort of is appropriating the funding out of the general fund and appropriating us to go raise money to put it back in the general fund to reimburse, right, effectively?
You lost me, but I don't think it's something we have to solve tonight.
Okay. This is regarding the fire truck.
I understand that, but the logistics of what we would do is solvable. I don't think it's something we need to ponder tonight. Like that.
Okay. We have 2 minutes to approve.
Yep, because.
In 2 minutes.
2 minutes to approve 2 minutes.
February 13th and March 5th. Regular meeting.
On March 5th, Taylor caught that in the list of other attendees, it said John Zagroski for select men, and it will be changed to for select man.
Well, he does the work of many.
That's momentous.
You like that? Actually, do read this.
I ran it by this. I'll make a motion.
Yeah, I'll take it, accept the motion to approve the minutes of February 13th, 2024.
So moved.
Dan moves, Dave seconds, all those in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous, and I'll accept the motion to approve the minutes of March 5th, 2024. John moves, Dave seconds, all those in favor? Unanimous. I think, given the time, do we want to skip any special assignments? Or anything material update on HHR?
Things continue to roll along with HHR. They're working on getting together communication plans for with the principals and the parents and the neighbors for all of those schools to let them know. Trailers are expected to be delivered to all of the sites in mid-May. There's some prep work that has to go on around that, and that way that would allow the trailers to be fully operational and ready to run come the end of May when construction is scheduled to start in June. So that's all on plan.
Okay. And with respect to all the contracts that were sort of hanging around, waiting for all the approvals to take place, were those all able to be, I guess we executed the master contracts, we kind of don't care, right?
We executed the master contract. The finalization of all the subs is on O&G to make it happen.
Got it. Okay. Anything else, any other special assignments? Are you almost on Oxford yet?
Kip would kill to be done with Oxford. He said
Yes.
he's kicking and screaming to get it across the finish line with
Yeah,
the
it's just the
final
dribble from a leaky
invoices
faucet.
and all
This-
the little
this-
things, yeah.
Well, the bonds mature in 17 years, so tell me he should be done by then.
Well,
Okay.
hopefully for his sake.
Nothing on the chairman's report, any new business?
No.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I'll accept the motion to adjourn. Dan moves. Dave seconds. All those in favor? We're adjourned.